Hey everyone, tonight we embark upon the most tragic and magnificent tale ever told among the stars. The complete chronicle of how the galaxy's greatest hope became its darkest nightmare. How a republic that stood for 1,000 generations crumbled in mere decades. How the Jedi Order, guardians of peace and justice, were betrayed by the very prophecy they trusted most. This is the story of Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one who was meant to bring balance to the Force, yet instead plunged the galaxy into an age of darkness that would span decades. A tale of forbidden love, political manipulation, and the thin line between salvation and damnation. So before we begin this epic journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here's something that might surprise you. Nearly 90% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. Your subscription truly helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more of these cinematic stories. And if you're fascinated by epic tales from other legendary worlds, you'll want to check out my new channel, The Revan's Tales, where I explore the rich mythology of Game of Thrones. I've added the link in the description below. I'm genuinely curious to know where you're listening from around the world and what time it is in your corner of the galaxy. Drop a comment and let me know. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected through these stories, whether it's midnight in New York or dawn in Tokyo. Now get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's drift into a galaxy far, far away together. Long ago, in the waning days of the Old Republic, when the Jedi Temple's spires pierced the clouds of Coruscant and 10,000 star systems thrived under the banner of democracy, a shadow began to stir. Ancient and patient, it had waited centuries for this moment. The Sith, thought extinct for a millennium, had returned. But this shadow would not announce itself with fleets or armies. Instead, it would work through whispers and political maneuvering, through the corruption of the pure and the seduction of the righteous. Most cunningly of all, it would use the Jedi's own prophecy against them. For in the outer reaches of the galaxy, on a desert world where twin suns scorched the sand, a child was born who should not have been possible. A child born of the Force itself, with power beyond measure, and a destiny that would shake the very foundations of the universe. Yet in the moment of his birth, the Force whispered a warning that none would heed until it was far too late. Balance, it seemed, required both light and darkness. And sometimes the greatest light must pass through the deepest shadow before it can shine again. The question that haunted the galaxy was simple. Would the Chosen One fulfill the prophecy, or would the prophecy fulfill him? To understand the magnitude of what was to come, we must first witness the galaxy at its zenith. 32 years before a farm boy on Tatooine would gaze upon twin suns and dream of adventure, the Republic stood as a beacon of hope across 1,000,000 worlds. Coruscant, the capital of this vast democracy, was a planet transformed entirely into one endless city. Layer upon layer of gleaming towers stretched toward the stars, their surfaces catching the light of passing starships like jewels in an infinite crown. In the highest spires, senators from countless species debated the fate of star systems, while far below in the shadowed depths, the forgotten masses struggled to survive in the Undercity's perpetual twilight. At the heart of this urban galaxy stood the Jedi Temple, its ancient pyramidal structure, a testament to 10,000 years of peacekeeping tradition. Within its sacred halls, the sounds of training sabers hummed through meditation chambers, where younglings learned to touch the living Force. The great library held the collected wisdom of ages, its holocrons glowing softly with the preserved knowledge of Jedi Masters, long since become one with the Force. Here, in chambers that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the Jedi Council convened, 12 of the wisest beings in the galaxy, each a master of the Force's mysteries, yet none could perceive the shadow that had already begun to envelop their order. For the dark side clouds everything, and the future had become as murky as the depths of space between stars. On the pastoral world of Naboo, where crystal-clear lakes reflected emerald hills and ancient cities rose from cliffs like natural growths of stone and light. Queen Amidala ruled with wisdom beyond her years. Her people had known peace for generations, their culture a harmonious blend of the elegant and the practical, the beautiful and the functional. Yet even here, in this paradise untouched by the conflicts that plagued the galaxy's edge, the tendrils of a greater conspiracy were about to take root. And in the outer rim, where the Republic's influence waned like dying starlight, twin suns blazed over endless dunes of sand. Tatooine, they called it, a world so remote and harsh that even the Republic's tax collectors rarely ventured there. Here, in the scorching heat and bitter cold of the desert's embrace, slavery flourished beyond the reach of civilized law. Here, moisture farmers eked out meager existences, while Jawa scavenged the metallic bones of crashed starships, and Tusken raiders haunted the deep desert like ghosts of a forgotten age. It was into this galaxy of light and shadow that our tale's true architect had already begun to weave his web. For there existed a figure who moved between the gleaming halls of power and the darkest corners of the underworld with equal ease. A man who wore the face of a humble senator while harboring the ambitions of an ancient Sith Lord. The Jedi had a saying, "The Force will be with you." Yet they had forgotten that the Force has two sides, and what serves the light may also serve the darkness. For every action, the Force demands balance, and the greater the light, the deeper the shadow it must cast. Our journey begins, not with the clash of lightsabers or the roar of starfighters, but with something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. It begins with the simple decision of the Jedi Council to send two of their most trusted knights on what appeared to be a routine diplomatic mission. Master Qui-Gon Jinn, a student of the living force whose unconventional wisdom often troubled his more traditional colleagues, and his faithful Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, whose dedication to the Jedi Code was matched only by his loyalty to his master. They could not have known, as their ship descended through Naboo's atmosphere, that they were not responding to a trade dispute, but to the opening move in a game of galactic chess that had been planned for decades. They could not have foreseen that their mission would lead them not just to a blockaded planet, but to a desert world where the Force itself had taken flesh and walked among mortals. The prophecy spoke of a chosen one, born of no father, who would bring balance to the Force and destroy the Sith. For 1,000 years, the Jedi had debated its meaning, wondering if such a being would ever come to pass. Yet in their contemplation of ancient texts and scholarly discussions, they had failed to consider the most crucial question of all. What if the prophecy was not a promise, but a warning? What if balance could only be achieved through the destruction of everything they held dear? What if the Chosen One's destiny was not to save the galaxy, but to remake it entirely? The answers to these questions lay waiting in the sand-swept streets of Mos Espa, in the form of a 9-year-old slave boy whose laughter carried the echo of stars being born, and whose tears would one day drown the light of 1,000 suns. The tranquil blue-green sphere of Naboo hung in space like a jewel against the cosmic darkness. Its surface swirled with clouds that drifted lazily over continents of emerald forests and crystal-clear lakes. Yet this natural beauty was marred by the ominous presence of massive Trade Federation battleships that had formed a metallic ring around the planet. These colossal vessels, each the size of a small moon and bristling with turbo-laser batteries, cast long shadows across Naboo's surface as they maintained their stranglehold on the peaceful world. Within the sterile corridors of the lead battleship, where the air recyclers hummed with mechanical efficiency, and the walls gleamed with the cold light of countless displays, Neimoidian Viceroy Newt Gunray paced nervously before a shimmering holographic projector. His amphibious features, marked by the distinctive cranial ridges of his species, were twisted with anxiety as he awaited communication from his mysterious benefactor. The Trade Federation had grown wealthy through commerce and negotiation, not through military conquest, and the Viceroy found himself uncomfortable in the role of aggressor. The hologram that materialized before him was a study in calculated menace. The figure that appeared was cloaked in shadow, face hidden beneath a dark hood that seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. Yet even through the flickering blue projection, his presence radiated an authority that made the Trade Federation leader's hands tremble involuntarily. This was Darth Sidious, though his true identity remained concealed even from his most trusted pawns. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of ancient malice and infinite patience, each word carefully chosen to instill both fear and compliance. The plan, as Sidious outlined it with the methodical precision of a master strategist, was elegant in its simplicity yet devastating in its scope. The blockade would force Queen Amidala to sign a treaty legitimizing the Trade Federation's occupation of Naboo, transforming what appeared to be an illegal act of aggression into a legally binding contract. The Galactic Senate, mired in bureaucratic procedure and political maneuvering that had grown increasingly complex over the centuries, would be powerless to act swiftly enough to prevent this coup. By the time they had navigated through the labyrinthine process of senatorial debate and committee review, Naboo would be firmly under Trade Federation control, and the young queen would be reduced to a puppet ruler who danced to their tune. The Nenmoidians, for all their commercial acumen, were not warriors by nature. They preferred the battlefield of the marketplace to actual combat, but they had at their disposal something far more reliable than organic soldiers, battle droids, manufactured in the millions in their automated factories, marched with perfect synchronization through the ship's hangar bays. These mechanical soldiers felt no fear, required no rest, and would follow orders without question until their circuits failed or their bodies were destroyed. They were the perfect army for those who sought conquest without the moral complications of sending living beings to their deaths. Yet even as Sidious spoke of inevitable victory, 2 Jedi had already penetrated the blockade with the silent efficiency that had made their order legendary throughout the galaxy. The Republic's ambassadorship, a sleek vessel bearing the diplomatic seals that had guaranteed safe passage for centuries, had approached under the protection of ancient treaties that even the Trade Federation dared not openly violate. Within its hull, 2 guardians of peace and justice prepared to engage in what they believed would be routine negotiations, unknowingly setting in motion the events that would reshape the galaxy's destiny. Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi materialized aboard the Trade Federation flagship through the shimmering effect of the transport beam, their brown robes marking them as members of the ancient order that had maintained peace for 1,000 generations. The older Jedi, tall and serene with graying hair that spoke of decades spent in communion with the Force, carried himself with the quiet confidence of one who had faced darkness in all its forms and emerged stronger for the experience. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, held the wisdom of countless worlds visited and countless conflicts resolved through patience and understanding rather than violence. His Padawan, Obi-Wan Kenobi, represented the future of the Jedi Order in all its promise and complexity. Younger and more eager than his master, he possessed a dedication to the Jedi Code that was both his greatest strength and perhaps his greatest limitation. Where Qui-Gon often bent the rules in service of what he perceived as the greater good, Obi-Wan sought to perfect himself through strict adherence to the principles that had guided the Jedi for millennia. His lightsaber hung at his side with the comfortable weight of a tool he had mastered through countless hours of practice, yet his greatest weapon was his unwavering moral compass. Together, they represented the best of the Jedi tradition, the culmination of centuries of careful selection and training that had produced guardians capable of standing against the darkness. Yet they were walking into a trap that had been set before either of them was born, a web of deception so intricate that even their connection to the Force could not fully illuminate its true scope. The Trade Federation's representatives greeted them with the elaborate courtesy that galactic diplomacy demanded, their movements precise, and their words carefully chosen to reveal nothing of their true intentions. The conference room, where they were escorted, was a study in understated luxury, its walls adorned with holographic displays showing the fleet's positions and the planet's major population centers. Refreshments were offered with the kind of attention to detail that suggested the Federation had studied their guests' preferences extensively. The negotiations, by all appearances, were meant to be a mere formality, a peaceful resolution to what the galactic media had characterized as a simple trade dispute. The Federation's grievances seemed reasonable on the surface, their concerns about taxation and regulation, the kind of issues that had been resolved through dialogue countless times before. Yet as the two Jedi waited in the conference room, breathing in air that grew increasingly thick with the scent of deception, they sensed something amiss through their connection to the Force. The living force, that aspect of the cosmic energy field that flowed through all things, seemed to whisper warnings that only those trained in its mysteries could perceive. It was like wind through ancient trees, speaking of danger that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. Qui-Gon's hand moved unconsciously toward his lightsaber, not in preparation for battle, but in the unconscious gesture of one who had learned to trust the Force's guidance above all else. The betrayal, when it came, arrived with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm breaking over a peaceful landscape. The conference room's doors hissed open to reveal not negotiators, but instruments of death. Droidekas, destroyer droids that unfolded like metallic flowers of death, rolled into the chamber with their energy shields crackling with barely contained power. These machines, more advanced than the standard battle droids that formed the Federation's army, were specifically designed to eliminate Jedi, their shields and rapid-fire blasters, a response to the lightsaber's legendary effectiveness. The chamber filled with the brilliant flash of blaster fire as the Trade Federation revealed its true intentions with devastating clarity. The Jedi had not come to negotiate, but to be eliminated. Their deaths the first casualties in a war that would consume the galaxy. The conference table, moments before a symbol of diplomatic discourse, became cover as coherent light beams seared the air where the two Jedi had been standing. Yet the Force flowed through its servants like a river of light, and what had been intended as an execution became instead a demonstration of why the Jedi were both revered and feared throughout the galaxy. Lightsabers ignited with their distinctive hum, the sound that had brought hope to the oppressed and terror to the corrupt for countless generations. Blue and green blades cut through the air with impossible grace, their plasma edges capable of slicing through nearly any material known to science. The battle that followed was a symphony of movement and light, two warriors dancing through a storm of blaster fire, with the fluid precision of those guided by the living force itself. The destroyer droids, for all their shields and firepower, were no match for opponents who could sense their attacks before they were made, who moved with reflexes enhanced by their connection to the cosmic energy that bound all things together. Each deflected shot, each graceful leap, each precisely timed strike was a testament to decades of training and an unshakable faith in the Force's guidance. The conflict was brief but decisive, the outcome never truly in doubt, once the Jedi had overcome their initial surprise. As the smoke cleared and the destroyed droids lay scattered like broken toys across the conference room floor, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their shared understanding of what they had just witnessed. This was no mere trade dispute, no simple disagreement over taxation policies or commercial regulations. Something far more dangerous was at work, something that threatened not just Naboo, but the very foundations of the Republic itself. Their journey to the planet's surface became a test of every skill they possessed, a harrowing descent through a blockade that had been designed to prevent exactly such an infiltration. The Trade Federation's battle cruisers, alerted to their presence by the failed ambush, turned their massive guns toward the small diplomatic vessel that carried the two Jedi. Turbo laser fire lit up the space around Naboo like a deadly aurora, each shot capable of vaporizing a building, yet somehow failing to find its target as the Force guided their pilot through the maze of destruction. The planet's surface, when they finally reached it, told a story of invasion and occupation that made both Jedi's hearts heavy with sorrow. The Trade Federation's droid army had already begun its methodical conquest, mechanical soldiers marching in perfect formation through the streets of Theed, the capital city that had known only peace for centuries. Their footsteps echoed off ancient stone walls with the rhythmic precision of a funeral march, each step a countdown toward the death of everything the Naboo held dear. Yet even as they landed in the swamps outside the city, where the air hung thick with moisture and the sounds of native wildlife provided a stark contrast to the mechanical precision of the invasion, the two Jedi encountered something that would prove crucial to their mission. The Force, in its infinite wisdom, had guided them to an unlikely ally, a being whose clumsiness and apparent incompetence masked a loyalty and courage that would prove invaluable in the trials ahead. Jar Jar Binks was a Gungan, a member of the amphibious species that had shared Naboo with the human settlers for generations. His lanky frame and distinctive ears marked him as different from the humans who dominated the planet's surface, but his expressive eyes held an intelligence that his bumbling manner often concealed. Exiled from his underwater city for minor infractions that spoke more to his curious nature than any malicious intent, he had been wandering the swamps in lonely isolation when fate brought him into the path of the two Jedi. The Gungan's people, as the Jedi soon learned, represented more than just an alternative to the human settlements that had fallen under Trade Federation control, led by the stern but wise Boss Nass, whose bulk and authority commanded respect from all who entered his presence. The Gungans had retreated to the depths of their sacred city when the invasion began. This underwater metropolis, with its organic architecture that seemed to grow from the lake bottom itself, was a marvel of biotechnology that had evolved over millennia to work in harmony with Naboo's aquatic ecosystems. Here, in chambers lit by bioluminescent creatures that pulsed with gentle rhythms and surrounded by the soothing sounds of flowing water, the Jedi learned of the ancient rivalry between the Gungans and the human settlers. It was a division rooted in misunderstanding and cultural differences, a chasm that had widened over the centuries as each group developed their own traditions and technologies. The Gungans, with their deep connection to the living world around them, viewed the humans as disconnected from the natural order. The humans in turn saw the Gungans as primitive and backward, unable to appreciate the benefits of technological advancement. Qui-Gon, with his understanding of the living force and his respect for all forms of life, recognized that this division could prove fatal if not overcome. Unity would be essential in the trials ahead, for the Trade Federation's strength lay not just in their military might, but in their ability to exploit the weaknesses and divisions of their enemies. The Jedi Master's words to Boss Nass carried the weight of prophecy, speaking of a shared destiny that would require both peoples to set aside their differences and work together toward their common salvation. The journey to reach Queen Amidala in the occupied palace required all the stealth and skill that the Jedi had learned over their years of training. The streets of Theed, once filled with the laughter of children and the conversations of merchants, now echoed with the metallic footsteps of battle droids and the whine of repulsor vehicles. The beautiful architecture that had taken centuries to develop, with its blend of classical elegance and modern functionality, was marred by the harsh additions of military occupation. Queen Amidala, when they finally reached her in the throne room that had been transformed into a prisoner's cell, proved to be far more than the helpless ruler the Trade Federation had expected. Though young, with features that spoke of both nobility and determination, she possessed a steel core wrapped in silk that no amount of intimidation could bend. Her ceremonial robes, elaborate affairs of rich fabric and intricate design, could not hide the sharp intelligence that blazed in her eyes, or the unshakable will that had made her a leader despite her youth. The Queen's decision to seek help from the Galactic Senate was not made lightly, for it required a courage that few twice her age possessed. It meant leaving her people under the brutal occupation of the Trade Federation while she journeyed to Coruscant, the capital world where the galaxy's representatives gathered to debate the fate of countless worlds. The risk was enormous, for there was no guarantee that the Senate would act swiftly enough to prevent the complete subjugation of her people. Yet she understood, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to those thrust into leadership by circumstance, that Naboo's salvation lay not in military resistance, but in the broader principles of justice and law that the Republic represented. The escape from Naboo tested every skill the Jedi possessed, a desperate flight through hostile space that required perfect coordination between pilot and passengers. Their ship, a sleek vessel designed for speed rather than combat, had been damaged by the Trade Federation's blockade, its hull scarred by near misses from turbo-laser fire, and its systems pushed beyond their normal operational limits. As they limped through space toward the nearest safe harbor, the damaged vessel's life support systems struggling to maintain proper atmosphere, it seemed as though fate itself was testing their resolve. It was then that destiny, or perhaps the Force itself, guided them to Tatooine, a world so insignificant that it barely appeared on most official star charts. This desert planet, scorched by the radiation of twin suns and scoured by winds that carried the dust of countless millennia, was a place where civilization had taken root only in the most stubborn and desperate pockets. Here, in the blazing heat that could kill an unprotected human in hours, and the bitter cold that followed each sunset, they would encounter the being who would change the course of galactic history. Tatooine was a world that the Republic had forgotten, a place where the rule of law had given way to the harsh justice of survival. The desert had bred a people as resilient as the stones beneath their feet, beings who had learned to extract moisture from the air itself and to find sustenance in the most barren landscapes. In the dusty streets of Mos Espa, where moisture farmers and junk dealers scratched out meager livings from the refuse of 1,000 worlds, where the very air shimmered with heat and the constant promise of violence, the Jedi sought the parts they needed to repair their ship and continue their mission. The spaceport was a monument to the entrepreneurial spirit that flourished in the galaxy's forgotten corners. A place where beings of countless species gathered to trade in everything from legitimate salvage to goods that would be illegal in more civilized systems. The buildings, constructed from whatever materials could be found or scavenged, rose from the desert like organic growths, their walls bearing the scars of countless sandstorms and the patina of age that spoke of centuries of continuous habitation. What they found in this unlikely place was a legend in the making, though none who witnessed it could have understood its true significance. Watto's junkyard was a testament to the refuse of galactic civilization, filled with spare parts from ships that had crashed in the desert or been sold by desperate travelers who needed credits more than they needed the means to leave this desolate world. The Toydarian proprietor, his insectoid wings beating frantically as he haggled in a dozen languages, was a merchant whose greed was matched only by his cunning and whose knowledge of mechanical systems was encyclopedic. Yet even this accomplished dealer in the galaxy's discarded technology seemed insignificant compared to the small figure working at a cluttered workbench in the corner of the shop. Anakin Skywalker was 9 years old, with hair like spun gold that caught the light of Tatooine's twin suns and eyes that held depths no child should possess. His hands, small and apparently delicate, worked with the precision of a master craftsman as he assembled a protocol droid from salvaged parts, each component fitting into place with the certainty of one who understood machinery at an almost instinctive level. Yet it was not his mechanical aptitude, impressive though it was, that made Qui-Gon pause in his negotiations with Watto and study the boy with growing wonder. It was the Force itself, flowing through the child like a river in flood, stronger than anything the Jedi Master had ever encountered in his decades of service to the Order. The boy's midi-chlorian count, when discreetly tested, was higher than any recorded in the Temple's archives. Higher even than the legendary Master Yoda's. When Qui-Gon knelt beside the boy and spoke to him, engaging him in conversation about his work and his dreams, he heard in Anakin's voice something that made his heart race with possibilities that seemed too fantastic to be real. The child spoke of dreams that came true with disturbing regularity, of reflexes that allowed him to be the only human who could pod race successfully, of a certainty that he would one day leave this desert world behind and travel to the stars. More significantly, he spoke of his mother, Shmi, a woman of quiet dignity who had carried him without the touch of any man, born of the Force itself in a manner that the ancient prophecies had foretold. The revelation hit Qui-Gon like a physical blow, the implications so staggering that he had to use every discipline he had learned to maintain his composure. For 1,000 years the Jedi had debated the meaning of the prophecy that spoke of a chosen one, a being who would arise to bring balance to the Force and destroy the Sith. Many had dismissed it as myth, a comforting story told to younglings to give them hope in dark times. Yet here, in the slave quarters of a junk dealer on one of the galaxy's most remote worlds, that prophecy might be taking flesh and walking among them. The boy's mother, Shmi Skywalker, was a woman whose strength had been forged in the crucible of suffering, yet had never been broken by it. Her life as a slave had taught her to find joy in small things, to protect what was precious with fierce determination, and to nurture hope even in the darkest circumstances. When she spoke of her son's birth, her voice carried the weight of mystery and miracle, of something that transcended the normal boundaries of existence. The decision to enter Anakin in the Boonta Eve Classic pod race was not made lightly, for it represented far more than a simple sporting event. This was a test of destiny itself, a trial that would determine whether the boy truly was the chosen one, or merely a gifted child whose abilities had been exaggerated by desperate hope. The great arena carved from Tatooine's bedrock was a testament to the planet's love of dangerous entertainment. Its tiers filled with beings from across the galaxy who had come to witness the most perilous racing in the known universe. Pod races, those magnificent and terrifying machines that consisted of massive engines connected by energy cables to a small cockpit, screamed across the desert at speeds that would tear apart any normal pilot. The forces involved were so extreme that only those with reflexes enhanced by the Force could hope to survive. Yet the sport attracted pilots from dozens of species, each believing that their particular advantages would allow them to triumph where others had failed. The other races were legends in their own right, beings whose names were spoken with reverence in cantinas across the Outer Rim. Sebulba, the Dug pilot, whose aggressive tactics and mechanical sabotage had earned him victories through means both fair and foul, commanded respect through fear and intimidation. His podracer, a marvel of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with repulsor-lift technology, was as much a weapon as it was a vehicle. Yet here was a 9-year-old human child, preparing to race against the galaxy's finest pilots in a machine that had been cobbled together from spare parts and fueled by nothing more than determination and hope. As Anakin climbed into his podracer, his small hands gripping controls that had been built for beings twice his size, the Force itself seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment upon which everything would turn, the pivot point where destiny would declare itself with unmistakable clarity. The race that followed was a symphony of speed and danger, of machines pushed beyond their limits, and pilots tested to their breaking point. Through the treacherous canyons of Tatooine, where the walls rose like cathedral spires, and the shadows held the bones of those who had failed, this test in years past, the podracers flew with reckless abandon, past the skeletal remains of ancient creatures that had once dominated this world, through valleys where the very rocks seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. Anakin flew with a skill that defied every law of physics and probability. His pod racer, inferior in every technical specification to those of his competitors, somehow kept pace with and eventually surpassed the field when mechanical failures and pilot errors eliminated his rivals one by one. When the desert itself seemed to conspire against those who challenged its dominion, Anakin's machine continued to perform with the reliability of something blessed by the Force itself. When he crossed the finish line, victorious against impossible odds, it was as if the Force itself had spoken through his triumph. The victory brought more than prize money and freedom from the slavery that had bound the Skywalker family for generations. It brought the attention of the Jedi Council, though their response to news of the boy's existence was far from the enthusiastic acceptance that Qui-Gon had hoped for. When he presented Anakin to the Council via hologram, speaking of midi-chlorian counts that exceeded even the most optimistic projections and abilities that seemed to confirm the ancient prophecies, the reaction was one of caution rather than celebration. Master Yoda, ancient beyond measure and wise in the ways of the Force, studied the boy with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. The prophecy spoke of a chosen one, yes, but it also spoke of great danger, of a power that could as easily destroy as create. The path to the dark side was paved with good intentions, and the very strength that made Anakin special also made him vulnerable to the temptations that had corrupted others throughout history. The return to Naboo brought with it the promise of battle, but also the hope of redemption through unity. Queen Amidala, having failed to find the swift help she had sought in the corrupt halls of the Galactic Senate, had chosen to take her planet's fate into her own hands. Her decision to return to Naboo was not born of desperation but of wisdom, for she understood that true leadership meant sharing the risks faced by those she served. Her alliance with the Gungans, forged through mutual respect and shared desperation, represented something beautiful in a galaxy that was growing darker by the day. On the great grass plains of Naboo, where the ancient meeting grounds had witnessed centuries of Gungan history, two peoples set aside their differences to face a common enemy. The sight of human and Gungan forces standing together, their weapons and tactics complementing each other in ways that neither could have achieved alone, was a testament to the power of unity over division. The battle that followed was fought on multiple fronts, each crucial to the overall success of the liberation. High above Naboo's atmosphere, starfighters wheeled and danced in aerial combat, their laser cannons painting brief lines of light against the star-filled darkness. The space battle was a thing of terrible beauty, ships exploding in brief stars of fire, while their pilots fought with the desperation of those who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the enslavement of everything they held dear. On the ground, the Gungan army faced the seemingly endless ranks of Trade Federation battle droids with weapons that had been developed over centuries of isolation and innovation. Their organic technology, dismissed by many as primitive, proved remarkably effective against mechanical opponents who had been programmed to expect conventional warfare. Energy shields shimmered like soap bubbles over the battlefield, deflecting blaster fire while allowing the Gungans' plasma weapons to find their targets. Yet it was in the depths of the Theed Palace that the most significant battle was fought, a conflict that would determine not just the fate of Naboo, but the future of the galaxy itself. Here, in corridors that had known only peace for generations, where the walls were decorated with tapestries depicting centuries of harmony between different species, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan faced an enemy that had been thought extinct for a millennium. Darth Maul was a creature of pure malice, his red and black tattoos marking him as something that had emerged from the galaxy's darkest nightmares. The Zabrak warrior moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his yellow eyes reflecting the accumulated hatred of 1,000 years of Sith philosophy. The double-bladed lightsaber in his hands glowed with crimson fire, its twin blades spinning with hypnotic precision as he prepared to face the two Jedi who had disrupted his master's carefully laid plans. The duel that followed moved through the palace like a deadly dance. three warriors locked in combat that would determine whether the Sith would remain hidden in the shadows or emerge to claim their revenge against the Jedi who had destroyed their ancient empire. Each lightsaber blow was both an attack and a philosophy, each parry a statement about the nature of the Force itself. The corridor echoed with the clash of energy blades and the sound of breathing that had become labored with effort and emotion. When the ray shields separated the combatants, forcing them to wait in humming corridors of energy while the palace's security systems cycled through their predetermined patterns, the tension was almost unbearable. Qui-Gon, separated from both his apprentice and his enemy, knelt in meditation while death waited mere meters away. In those moments of enforced stillness, he made his peace with the Force, opening himself completely to the living energy that flowed through all things. The Jedi Master's final meditation was a thing of beauty and sorrow, an acceptance of whatever fate the Force had decreed for him. He had trained Obi-Wan as best he could, had found the boy who might be the chosen one, and now he would trust in the Force to guide the galaxy toward its destiny. When the shields dropped and combat resumed, Qui-Gon fought with the serene determination of one who had already accepted whatever outcome awaited him. The end came with shocking swiftness, Maul's lightsaber finding its mark with a precision that spoke of years of training in the dark arts. Qui-Gon Jinn, Knight of the Old Republic, guardian of peace and justice, fell to the floor of the palace with a wound that no healing could mend. His final words to Obi-Wan were both a plea and a command, a passing of responsibility from master to student that would echo through the ages and shape the destiny of the galaxy itself. The young Padawan's grief transformed into something far more dangerous than anger, crystallizing into the kind of resolve that comes only to those who have lost everything they hold dear. The lightsaber in his hands was no longer just a weapon but an extension of his will, and his will was focused on one simple, terrible goal: justice for his master and an end to the creature that had taken him away from a galaxy that still needed his wisdom. The death of Darth Maul was swift but brought no satisfaction to the young Jedi who had delivered it. Even as the Sith apprentice fell into the reactor shaft, his body bisected by Obi-Wan's blade, the young Jedi knew that this was only the beginning. The darkness that had created this monster still lurked somewhere in the galaxy, patient and powerful, waiting for its next move in a game that spanned not just years but decades. In the aftermath of victory, as Naboo celebrated its liberation with festivals that lasted for days, and the Trade Federation's leaders were led away in restraints that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of their crimes, the Jedi Council faced a decision that would haunt them for years to come. Anakin Skywalker, the boy who had helped save a world through his courage and skill, stood before them with hope shining in his eyes like captured starlight. The Council's reluctance was palpable, their fear of his power evident in every measured word and careful gesture. They had studied the prophecies, had debated their meaning for centuries, yet when confronted with their possible fulfillment, they found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty. The boy's strength in the Force was undeniable, his potential limitless, yet the very magnitude of his abilities made him dangerous in ways that even the wisest among them could not fully comprehend. It was Obi-Wan who broke the deadlock, his grief over Qui-Gon's death transforming into determination to honor his master's final wish. He would train the boy, he declared with a conviction that surprised even himself, with or without the Council's blessing. The promise he made that day, spoken over his master's funeral pyre as the flames carried Qui-Gon's body toward the stars, would bind him to a destiny that he could not imagine, and would not have chosen had he known its true cost. Yet even as hope seemed to dawn with the liberation of Naboo as the celebration continued and the future looked bright with promise, darkness was taking root in the very heart of the Republic. In the Senate chambers on Coruscant, where representatives from 1,000 worlds had once debated in harmony, guided by principles of justice and mutual benefit, a new chancellor had been elected through processes that seemed democratic, yet served purposes that were anything but. Palpatine of Naboo, the humble senator who had guided Queen Amidala through the political labyrinth of the capital, now held the highest office in the galaxy. His ascension seemed natural, even inevitable, the logical result of his planet's suffering and his own demonstrated competence in navigating the complex currents of galactic politics. The crowds that cheered his acceptance of the chancellorship saw in him hope for a more efficient government, a leader who could cut through the bureaucratic paralysis that had allowed the Naboo crisis to occur. None among them suspected that they were witnessing not the salvation of the Republic, but the first step in its carefully orchestrated destruction. The applause that echoed through the great rotunda was the death knell of 1,000 years of democracy, though it would be years before anyone understood what they had truly lost. As the celebrations continued into the night, as fireworks painted the sky above the Seed with colors that rivaled the aurora of distant gas giants, the pieces were already in motion for the next phase of a grand design that would reshape the galaxy according to the will of the Sith. The prophecy spoke of balance, but balance in the Force was not the gentle equilibrium that the Jedi had assumed it would be. It was the terrible scales of destiny, weighted with the fate of countless worlds and the lives of billions of beings, and the fulcrum upon which everything turned was a former slave boy from Tatooine who carried within him the power to either save the galaxy or damn it to eternal darkness. The choice, when it came, would be his alone to make, and the consequences would echo through generations yet unborn. 10 years had passed since the liberation of Naboo, and the galaxy had aged like a star approaching the end of its life, growing both brighter and more unstable with each passing day. The Republic that had once stood as a beacon of democracy across 1,000,000 worlds now found itself fractured by discord, its foundations weakened by the very forces it had been created to unite. In the gleaming towers of Coruscant, where senators debated the fate of star systems with words that carried the weight of worlds, the political landscape had shifted like sand in a desert storm. The separatist movement had begun as whispers in the Outer Rim, complaints from worlds that felt abandoned by a government too distant to understand their needs. Yet under the charismatic leadership of Count Dooku, these whispers had grown into a roar that echoed across the galaxy. The former Jedi, whose noble bearing and silver hair spoke of wisdom earned through decades of service, had renounced his connection to the Order and emerged as the voice of those who sought independence from what they saw as a corrupt and ineffective republic. Dooku's transformation from Jedi Master to political revolutionary had sent shockwaves through the temple, where his former colleagues struggled to understand how one of their most respected members could have fallen so far from the path of light. Yet to those who listened to his speeches, broadcast across the HoloNet to billions of beings on thousands of worlds, his message resonated with the truth of lived experience. The Republic had grown too large, too bureaucratic, too removed from the suffering of its people to serve their needs effectively. Behind the scenes, corporate interests had begun to align with the separatist cause, their massive droid armies and unlimited resources transforming what might have been a peaceful political movement into something far more dangerous. The Trade Federation, their defeat at Naboo still fresh in their collective memory, had thrown their support behind Dooku's movement, bringing with them the manufacturing might that could produce battle droids by the millions. The banking clan, the corporate alliance, and the techno-union had all pledged their resources to the cause, creating a military-industrial complex that rivaled anything the Republic could field. Yet even as the galaxy teetered on the brink of civil war, life continued in the corridors of power, where the fate of billions was decided by beings who had never known hunger or fear. Senator Padme Amidala had returned to Coruscant, her youthful beauty now tempered by the wisdom that came from ruling a world under siege. No longer the teenage queen who had liberated Naboo through courage and determination, she had evolved into a skilled politician whose voice carried weight in the halls of the Senate. The years had been kind to her, in some ways harsh in others. Her face had retained its ethereal beauty, but her eyes now held depths that spoke of responsibilities beyond her years. The elaborate gowns and painted faces of her royal years had given way to the more practical attire of a working senator. Yet she moved through the political landscape with the same grace that had once made her a symbol of hope to her people. It was her opposition to the Military Creation Act that had made her a target, though she could not have known the true scope of the forces arrayed against her. The proposed legislation would grant the Republic the authority to create a standing army, something that had been unthinkable for 1,000 years of peace. Yet as the separatist threat grew daily, more and more senators found themselves swayed by the arguments of those who claimed that only military strength could preserve the democracy they all cherished. The assassination attempt came without warning. An explosion that tore through the landing platform where her ship had just touched down. The blast, designed to appear as a mechanical failure, would have killed her instantly had not her loyal handmaiden taken her place at the crucial moment. Corday's sacrifice, dying in the clothes and makeup that had made her indistinguishable from the senator she served, was a reminder of the price that loyalty demanded in a galaxy where political disagreement had become a matter of life and death. The Jedi Council's response to the threat against Senator Amidala's life was swift and decisive. Obi-Wan Kenobi, now a full Knight of the Order, was assigned to investigate the assassination attempt, while his former Padawan would be responsible for the senator's protection. The decision to pair them together again was born of practical necessity, yet it would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in galactic history. Anakin Skywalker had grown from the enthusiastic boy who had won the Boonta Eve Classic into a young man whose presence commanded attention in any room he entered. Tall and lean, with the kind of natural grace that came from a lifetime of training, he moved through the world with the confidence of one who had never encountered a challenge he could not overcome. His mechanical aptitude, evident even in childhood, had evolved into an almost supernatural understanding of technology that made him invaluable to his fellow Jedi. Yet for all his abilities, Anakin carried within him a restlessness that troubled those who knew him best. The Jedi Code spoke of serenity and detachment, of finding peace through acceptance of the Force's will. These concepts, which came naturally to most of his peers, seemed to chafe against something fundamental in his nature. Where other Jedi found strength in letting go, Anakin found only frustration with limitations that seemed arbitrary and cruel. His reunion with Padme in the gleaming towers of Coruscant was a moment charged with possibilities that neither dared to acknowledge. The senator, now a woman whose beauty had been refined by experience and hardship, found herself face to face with the boy who had risked everything to help save her world. Yet this was no longer the innocent child who had shared his dreams of adventure among the stars. This was a man whose eyes held depths that spoke of power barely contained, of emotions that ran deeper than the carefully controlled surface he presented to the world. The subtle dance of attraction that began between them was all the more dangerous for its innocence. Neither fully understood the forces that drew them together, the way their conversations lingered longer than necessary, the way their eyes met across crowded rooms with a recognition that transcended mere friendship. The Jedi Code was clear about attachment, yet the heart had its own wisdom that often contradicted the mind's careful reasoning. Obi-Wan's investigation into the assassination attempt led him down a path that would reshape his understanding of the threats facing the Republic. The weapon used in the attack, a toxic dart of unusual design, had been crafted by beings whose existence was known only to the most skilled bounty hunters. His search for answers led him to the rain-soaked streets of Coruscant's entertainment district, where beings from across the galaxy gathered to forget their troubles in establishments that catered to every conceivable vice. The nightclub where his investigation led him was a monument to the Republic's decadence, its multiple levels teeming with species from across the known galaxy. Here, in the swirling smoke and pulsing music, deals were made that would never appear in any official record. The clientele included politicians seeking pleasures their constituents would never approve, corporate executives arranging transactions that existed in the gray areas of galactic law, and criminals whose very presence was a reminder that the Republic's justice had limits. It was here that Obi-Wan encountered Zam Wesell, a shape-shifting assassin whose Claudite heritage allowed her to assume any form she chose. The chase that followed was a testament to the changed nature of the galaxy, a pursuit that took them through the vertical cityscape of Coruscant in a way that would have been unthinkable during the peaceful years of the Republic's golden age. Speeders raced between buildings that stretched toward the stars, their occupants engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse that could end in death for either hunter or prey. The assassin's death, when it came, was swift and silent. A toxic dart, identical to the one used in the attack on Senator Amidala, found its mark before she could reveal the identity of her employer. Her final words, spoken with the resignation of one who had always known this moment would come, spoke of a bounty hunter named Jango Fett. The name meant nothing to Obi-Wan, yet it would soon lead him to discoveries that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about the Republic's strength and the Jedi's wisdom. Meanwhile, on Naboo, Anakin found himself in a paradise that seemed designed to test every aspect of his Jedi training. The planet's natural beauty, unchanged in the decades since its liberation, provided a backdrop for emotions that the young Jedi struggled to understand. The meadows where nerf herds grazed in peaceful contentment, the lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors of liquid starlight, the ancient cities that rose from cliff tops like natural outgrowths of the stone itself, all combined to create an environment where the normal rules of the galaxy seemed suspended. Senator Amidala, freed from the constraints of her official duties, revealed herself to be a woman of remarkable depth and complexity. Her formal senatorial robes gave way to simpler clothing that spoke of her connection to the world she served, yet her beauty was enhanced rather than diminished by the change. In the soft light of Naboo's sun as they walked through gardens that had been tended by her people for generations, she seemed to glow with an inner radiance that made Anakin's heart race with feelings he had been trained to suppress. Their conversations, conducted in the shade of trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, revealed the profound loneliness that both carried within them. Padme spoke of the isolation that came with leadership, of the weight of making decisions that affected millions of lives, of the personal sacrifices that public service demanded. Anakin, in turn, revealed something of the struggle he faced in reconciling his human emotions with the Jedi ideal of detachment. The picnic by the lake, where they shared food and stories under a sky that seemed to stretch into infinity, marked a turning point in their relationship. The formal barriers that had separated Senator from Protector began to crumble, replaced by something more honest and infinitely more dangerous. When Padme spoke of her dreams of a simpler life, of a future where she could lay down the burdens of leadership and find peace in ordinary pleasures, Anakin saw in her words a reflection of his own deepest desires. Yet even as love bloomed in the paradise of Naboo, darkness was gathering in the depths of space. Obi-Wan's investigation had led him to Kamino, a world that existed beyond the edge of the known galaxy, where endless storms raged over oceans that had never known the touch of land. The planet's very existence had been erased from the Jedi archives, a fact that troubled him more than any physical danger he might face. The Kaminoans, tall and elegant beings whose pale skin and large eyes spoke of adaptation to their storm-swept world, greeted him with the courtesy due to a valued customer. Their city, built on platforms that rose from the ocean like artificial islands, was a marvel of engineering that had been designed to withstand the fury of storms that could level mountains. Yet it was not their architectural achievements that made Kamino significant, but rather the product they had spent a decade perfecting in secret. The clone army, when Obi-Wan first laid eyes upon it, represented both the answer to the Republic's prayers and the fulfillment of its worst nightmares. Rank upon rank of identical soldiers, their faces bearing the features of Jango Fett, stood in perfect formation in training facilities that stretched beyond the horizon. Each clone had been engineered for enhanced strength and reflexes, their genetic template modified to ensure absolute loyalty to their commanders. They were the perfect soldiers, created without the moral complications that came with asking free beings to die for their government. Jango Fett himself was a study in controlled violence, a man whose every movement spoke of deadly competence earned through years of surviving in a profession where a single mistake meant death. His Mandalorian armor, scarred by battles across the galaxy, was both protection and symbol, marking him as a member of a warrior culture that had once conquered star systems through sheer martial prowess. His young son Boba was an unaltered clone who would grow up to inherit his father's profession and his hunger for revenge against the Jedi, who would soon destroy his world. The revelation that the clone army had been ordered by a Jedi master named Sepho Dyas, who had died years before the order was supposedly placed, added another layer of mystery to an already complex situation. The Kaminoans, focused on the technical aspects of their creation, had paid little attention to the political implications of their work. They had been commissioned to create an army for the Republic, and they had fulfilled their contract with the precision that had made them renowned throughout the galaxy. Yet even as Obi-Wan marveled at the efficiency of the cloning process, he sensed something darker beneath the surface. The Force, that cosmic energy that flowed through all living things, seemed muted in the presence of the clones, as if their artificially created minds were somehow less connected to the universal tapestry than those born through natural means. It was a subtle difference, one that even a trained Jedi might miss, yet it spoke to fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and free will. The tracking device that led Obi-Wan to Geonosis revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that threatened the Republic. The desert planet, with its red rocks and industrial complexes, had become the headquarters of the separatist movement. Here, in factories that worked around the clock to produce weapons of war, the corporate interests that funded the rebellion were preparing for a conflict that would dwarf anything the galaxy had seen in centuries. Count Dooku's presence on Geonosis was confirmation of what many in the Republic had feared but few had dared to voice. The former Jedi had not simply become a political leader. He had allied himself with forces that sought the Republic's destruction through military conquest. His elegant bearing and cultured voice could not disguise the fact that he had chosen the path of war over the way of peace that had once defined his life. The droid factories that Obi-Wan observed from his hiding place among the rocks were monuments to the industrial might that the Separatists had assembled. Battle droids by the millions marched off production lines that had been designed to operate without rest, their mechanical precision a stark contrast to the organic chaos of natural birth. Super battle droids, larger and more heavily armed than their standard counterparts, represented the next evolution in mechanical warfare, designed to overwhelm their enemies through sheer firepower and numbers. Meanwhile, on Tatooine, Anakin's return to the world of his birth brought with it a confrontation with the past that would scar his soul in ways that would never fully heal. The dreams that had been haunting him, visions of his mother's suffering that came to him in the dark hours before dawn, had grown so vivid that he could no longer dismiss them as mere nightmares. The Force, which had always been his guide and companion, seemed to be calling him back to the desert world he had left behind with such hope and determination. Shmi Skywalker's fate, as revealed by Watto and later confirmed by the Lars family, was a tale of tragedy that spoke to the cruel realities of life on the galaxy's edge. Her marriage to Clag Lars had brought her the freedom she had never dared to hope for, yet even that small measure of happiness had been snatched away by the brutal realities of desert survival. The Tusken Raiders, those mysterious nomads who haunted the deep desert like ghosts of a forgotten age, had taken her during a raid that had cost the Lars family dearly. The moisture farm where she had lived her final years was a testament to the quiet heroism of ordinary people who chose to make their lives in places where survival was never guaranteed. Owen Lars, now Anakin's stepbrother, carried the weight of responsibility for the family's survival with the same quiet dignity that had marked his father's character. Beru, his wife, represented the kind of simple contentment that Anakin had once dreamed of, but now found increasingly difficult to understand. The Tusken camp, when Anakin finally located it through methods that owed more to rage than to Force sensitivity, was a scene from his darkest nightmares. His mother, broken by weeks of captivity and torture, died in his arms with words of love that made her suffering all the more unbearable. The massacre that followed was not the work of a Jedi Knight, but of a young man whose heart had been broken by the cruel realities of a galaxy that seemed to delight in punishing the innocent. The slaughter of the Tusken Raiders, men and women and children alike, was Anakin's first true step toward the darkness that would eventually consume him. Each death, delivered with the precision of a trained warrior, but motivated by the fury of a wounded animal, took him further from the path of light that the Jedi had tried to teach him. When he finally stood among the bodies of his enemies, his lightsaber still humming with the energy of violence, he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His confession to Padme, spoken in the depths of his grief and rage, revealed the depths of his inner turmoil. The woman who had come to love him saw in that moment both the man she had fallen for and the monster he might become. Her choice to comfort him rather than flee spoke to the power of love to blind even the wisest to the darkness that lay ahead. The message from Obi-Wan, transmitted from the depths of the Geonosis system, brought news that would change the course of galactic history. The Separatists had revealed the true scope of their military preparations, and the Republic would need to respond with force if it hoped to survive the coming storm. The clone army, created in secret and paid for by mysterious benefactors, would make its debut in a battle that would mark the beginning of the end for the 1,000-year peace. The arena on Geonosis, where Obi-Wan was scheduled to die for the entertainment of the Separatist leadership, became the focal point for a convergence of forces that would reshape the galaxy. The rescue attempt, led by Mace Windu and supported by a strike force of Jedi Knights, was intended to be a surgical operation that would eliminate the Separatist leadership and end the crisis before it could begin. Yet the Separatists had prepared for exactly such an eventuality. The arena, with its towering walls and cheering crowds, became a killing ground where the finest warriors of the Jedi Order faced overwhelming odds. The creatures released to dispatch the prisoners, great beasts whose claws and teeth had been honed by generations of selective breeding, were merely the opening act in a spectacle that would end with the systematic destruction of the Jedi strike force. The lightsaber battle that erupted when the Jedi revealed themselves was a thing of terrible beauty, hundreds of energy blades igniting simultaneously as the Guardians of Peace prepared to make their final stand. The arena filled with the sound of blasters and the clash of lightsabers, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the cries of the wounded. Each Jedi who fell was a loss that the Order could ill afford, yet they fought with the serene determination of those who had long ago accepted that their lives belonged to something greater than themselves. The arrival of the clone army, led by Master Yoda himself, marked the beginning of a new age in galactic history. The ancient Jedi Master, whose wisdom had guided the Order for centuries, now found himself commanding an army of artificially created soldiers in a battle that would determine the fate of the Republic. The sight of clone troopers, their white armor gleaming in the harsh light of Geonosis's sun, advancing in perfect formation against the droid armies of the Separatists, was both inspiring and deeply troubling. The battle that followed was the largest military engagement the galaxy had seen in centuries, a conflict that raged across multiple fronts and involved technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Clone troopers, their training enhanced by genetic modifications and their loyalty ensured by psychological conditioning, proved more than a match for the battle droids that had seemed so formidable on Naboo. Yet the cost of victory was measured not just in the destroyed machines that littered the battlefield, but in the transformation of the Jedi from peacekeepers into generals of war. As the dust settled over Geonosis and the survivors counted their losses, the galaxy found itself irrevocably changed. The Clone Wars had begun, and with them came the end of an age of peace that had lasted for 1,000 years. The Republic, strengthened by its new army but corrupted by the necessities of war, had taken its first steps toward becoming something its founders would not have recognized. In the aftermath of battle, as the survivors tended their wounds and prepared for the long conflict ahead, two young people found solace in each other's arms. Anakin and Padme's secret wedding, conducted in the gardens of Naboo, where they had first begun to fall in love, was a moment of joy in a galaxy that had suddenly become much darker. Their vows, spoken in the presence of droids who would keep their secrets, bound them together in a union that would produce both the galaxy's salvation and its doom. The prophecy of the Chosen One, which had seemed so clear when Anakin was a child, now appeared far more complex and troubling. Balance in the Force, the ancient texts had promised. Yet the war that was beginning would bring not peace but devastation on a scale that would dwarf anything in recorded history. The boy who had been born to save the galaxy had taken his first steps toward becoming the instrument of its destruction, and the future that had once seemed so bright now stretched ahead like a path through darkness with no end in sight. The galaxy had become a battlefield, its once peaceful star systems now echoing with the thunder of war that stretched across light years of space. What had begun as a political disagreement between the Republic and the Separatist movement had evolved into a conflict of unprecedented scale, one that would reshape the very nature of civilization itself. The Clone Wars, as historians would later call this dark period, represented not merely a military struggle, but a fundamental transformation of everything the Republic had stood for during its 1,000 years of existence. On countless worlds, the machinery of war had replaced the gentle rhythms of peace. Factories that had once produced consumer goods now churned out weapons and starships with relentless efficiency, their assembly lines working around the clock to feed the insatiable appetite of armies that numbered in the millions. The hyperlanes, once filled with merchant vessels carrying exotic goods and cultural treasures between distant worlds, now carried troopships and supply convoys under the protection of warships whose very existence would have been unthinkable during the Republic's golden age. The transformation was visible everywhere, from the smallest agricultural world to the most advanced industrial centers. On Kamino, the ocean world where the clone army had been created, the facilities that had produced the first generation of soldiers now worked at maximum capacity to replace the losses that mounted with each passing day. The Kaminoan cloners, tall and elegant beings whose clinical approach to life had made them ideal for their profession, watched with scientific detachment as their creations marched off to battles from which many would never return. In the shipyards of Kuat, where the massive star destroyers that would one day patrol the galaxy under imperial banners were already taking shape, workers labored in shifts that never ended. The industrial capacity that had once been devoted to exploration vessels and passenger liners now produced instruments of war whose destructive potential dwarfed anything the galaxy had seen since the ancient Sith Wars. The very shape of these vessels, triangular wedges bristling with weapons, spoke to a philosophy that prioritized intimidation over the peaceful exploration that had once defined the Republic's relationship with the unknown. The Jedi Order, those ancient guardians of peace and justice, found themselves thrust into roles for which their training had never prepared them. The temple on Coruscant, once a sanctuary of meditation and learning where the accumulated wisdom of millennia was preserved in crystalline holocrons, had been transformed into a military command center where holographic displays showed the positions of fleets and armies across the galaxy. The younglings who had once spent their days in peaceful study of the Force's mysteries now trained for a galaxy where lightsabers would be drawn in anger rather than defense, where the ancient ideals of the Jedi would be tested in ways that would challenge the very foundations of their philosophy. Master Yoda, whose wisdom had guided the Order for centuries and whose understanding of the Force was deeper than any living being's, now found himself dispensing strategic advice rather than spiritual guidance. The ancient Jedi's chambers, once filled with the gentle sounds of meditation and the rustle of turning pages in volumes that contained the distilled wisdom of ages, now echoed with the mechanical voices of holographic communications from battlefields across the galaxy. The weight of commanding an army, even one fighting for the noblest of causes, sat heavily on shoulders that had never been meant to bear such burdens. The irony was not lost on the wisest of the Jedi, that they, who had devoted their lives to the preservation of peace, had become the architects of the greatest war in galactic history. Each decision made in the war rooms of the temple, each tactical plan approved by the council, resulted in the deaths of thousands of beings whose only crime had been to find themselves on the wrong side of a conflict that had grown beyond anyone's ability to control. The clone troopers themselves represented one of the war's greatest moral complexities. These men, identical in appearance yet increasingly individual in spirit, had been created for one purpose alone, yet had developed personalities and loyalties that transcended their original programming. Each clone bore the face of Jango Fett, the Mandalorian bounty hunter, whose genetic template had been used to create an army. Yet as they served alongside their Jedi commanders, they became something more than mere copies of their template. Names like Rex, Cody, and Wolf became known throughout the army, clone commanders who had earned the respect of their men through courage and tactical brilliance rather than genetic inheritance. Captain Rex, whose service with Anakin Skywalker had taught him to think beyond the rigid parameters of his conditioning, exemplified the potential that lay within beings who had been designed as tools but had evolved into something approaching true consciousness. His distinctive helmet, marked with blue stripes that identified him as a member of the 501st Legion, became a symbol of the individual spirit that could emerge even from the most controlled circumstances. Commander Cody, whose partnership with Obi-Wan Kenobi had been forged in the crucible of countless battles, represented the ideal of the clone trooper as envisioned by their creators. Disciplined, loyal, and tactically brilliant, he had never questioned the orders that came from his Jedi general or the broader mission that had brought the clone army into existence. His orange-marked armor, worn with the pride of a soldier who had never known defeat, was a testament to the effectiveness of the Kaminoan cloning process. The bond between the Jedi and their clone commanders was perhaps the most poignant aspect of the war. These artificial beings, created in laboratories and trained from birth to follow orders without question, found themselves serving under leaders who valued their individuality and encouraged their growth as thinking beings. The Jedi, in turn, discovered that their clone troopers were not mere tools of war, but companions who would stand by them through the darkest hours of battle, men who had learned to trust their commanders, not because of their programming, but because of the relationships that had developed through shared hardship. On the war-torn world of Christophsis, where crystal formations rose from the planet's surface like frozen lightning and reflected the light of distant stars in patterns that seemed to change with the observer's mood, Anakin Skywalker first encountered the being who would become one of his greatest influences. The planet's surface, scarred by the passage of armies and the detonation of weapons that could shatter mountains, provided a stark backdrop for the meeting that would change both their lives forever. Ahsoka Tano, a young Togruta Padawan with distinctive blue and white head tails that marked her as a member of the colorful humanoid species from the world of Shili, had been assigned to him by the Jedi Council as a test of his readiness for greater responsibilities. The irony that the Council would entrust him with training another, while harboring doubts about his own emotional stability, was not lost on those who knew the young knight best. Her arrival, announced with the casual confidence that only the truly young could display, disrupted the careful balance that Anakin had maintained between his public role as a Jedi and his private struggles with the attachments that the code forbade. Ahsoka's first impression of her new master was colored by the stories she had heard of his exploits, tales of daring rescues and impossible victories that had made him a legend among the younger members of the Order. Yet the reality of Anakin Skywalker proved far more complex than the heroic figure of the stories. She found herself face to face with a young man whose power in the Force was undeniable, but whose emotional control was questionable, a knight whose brilliance was matched only by his capacity for reckless action. The young Padawan, barely 14 years old yet possessing a confidence that bordered on recklessness, challenged her master in ways that forced him to confront his own assumptions about teaching and responsibility. Her irreverent attitude toward authority, combined with a natural affinity for the Force that reminded many of Anakin's own early promise, made her both a trial and a blessing for the young knight. The nickname she gave him, Sky Guy, spoke to a casualness that would have been unthinkable in the formal atmosphere of the temple, yet it also reflected the genuine affection that would grow between them. The siege of Ryloth, homeworld of the Twistlick people, demonstrated the true horror of the Clone Wars and the lengths to which both sides would go to achieve victory. The planet's surface, once covered with lush vegetation and prosperous cities, where the graceful Twistlick had built a civilization that balanced technology with respect for the natural world, had been reduced to a wasteland by the separatist occupation. The droid armies, under the command of the tactical droid Wash Tambor, had systematically stripped the world of its resources while enslaving its population for labor in off-world facilities. The liberation of Ryloth required a coordinated assault that showcased the Republic's growing military sophistication. Admiral Yularen's fleet, supported by squadrons of clone pilots whose skill had been honed through countless battles and whose loyalty had been tested in the crucible of war, engaged the separatist blockade in a space battle that lit up the system with the fire of exploding starships. The tactical brilliance required to break through the enemy's defenses, combined with the sacrifice of countless clone pilots who died to ensure their comrades' success, demonstrated both the Republic's growing military prowess and the terrible cost of victory. On the planet's surface, clone troopers advanced through cities that had been reduced to rubble by the systematic destruction that marked the separatist occupation. Their white armor, designed to be visible on any battlefield and to inspire confidence in the Republic's citizens, stood out starkly against the reddish soil that had been stained with the blood of countless victims. Each building they cleared, each street they secured, revealed new evidence of the cruelty that had marked the occupation. The Twi'lek resistance, led by the charismatic Cham Syndulla, represented the kind of local forces that would become increasingly important as the war progressed. These freedom fighters, armed with salvaged weapons and sustained by their love for their homeland, had maintained a guerrilla campaign against the occupying forces despite overwhelming odds. Their knowledge of the local terrain, combined with their willingness to sacrifice everything for their world's freedom, made them invaluable allies to the Republic forces. Cham Syndulla himself was a figure who embodied the complexities of the war. A former politician who had taken up arms when peaceful means had failed, he represented the transformation that the conflict had forced upon countless beings throughout the galaxy. His decision to work with the Republic, despite his philosophical disagreements with its policies, demonstrated the kind of pragmatic alliances that had become necessary for survival in a galaxy torn apart by war. Yet, even as victories were won and worlds were liberated, the war was changing those who fought it in ways that would have profound consequences for the galaxy's future. Anakin Skywalker, once the enthusiastic boy who had dreamed of adventure among the stars, was becoming something harder and more ruthless with each battle. The responsibilities of command, combined with the constant presence of death and destruction, were wearing away at the compassion that had once defined his character. The transformation was subtle but inexorable. The young knight who had once been troubled by the necessity of taking life now dispatched enemies with clinical efficiency. The boy who had been horrified by the Tusken Raider massacre now commanded armies that killed by the thousands. Each victory, each successful mission, each life saved through the destruction of others pushed him further down a path that would ultimately lead to his damnation. The campaign on Umbara, perhaps the darkest chapter of the Clone Wars, revealed the extent to which the conflict had corrupted even the Jedi Order itself. The planet, shrouded in perpetual darkness and inhabited by beings whose loyalty to the Republic was questionable at best, became a testing ground for tactics that pushed the boundaries of what the Jedi considered acceptable. The world's surface, covered in bioluminescent plants that provided the only light in a landscape of perpetual twilight, created an atmosphere of constant unease that seemed to seep into the souls of those who fought there. General Pong Krell, a four-armed basilisk whose commanding presence had once inspired confidence in his troops, had been corrupted by visions of the Republic's fall and had begun to view his clone troopers as expendable tools rather than living beings. His massive frame, enhanced by cybernetic implants that increased his already formidable strength, dominated every room he entered. The four lightsabers that he wielded with devastating effectiveness had been turned against the very soldiers he was supposed to protect. The clones under Krell's command, men who had been trained to follow orders without question, and whose genetic conditioning had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of rebellion that was brewing in their ranks, found themselves caught between their programmed loyalty and their growing awareness that their general was leading them to pointless deaths. The internal conflict that this created was visible in every gesture, every hesitation, every moment of doubt that crossed their identical faces. The rebellion that eventually erupted among the ranks was unprecedented in the clone army's history, a moment when artificial beings chose to think for themselves rather than blindly follow orders that violated their basic sense of right and wrong. The sight of clone troopers turning their weapons on a Jedi general, beings who had been created to serve the Order without question, was a harbinger of the darkness that lay ahead. Captain Rex, the clone trooper who had served with distinction under Anakin's command and had learned to think beyond the rigid parameters of his conditioning, found himself at the center of this moral crisis. His decision to arrest General Krell, despite the violation of military protocol that such an action represented, was a defining moment that illustrated how the war was changing everyone involved. The execution of the traitorous Jedi, carried out by clone troopers who had been created to serve the Order, was a moment of such tragic irony that it seemed to embody everything that had gone wrong with the Republic's war effort. The personal cost of the war was perhaps most evident in the secret relationship between Anakin and Padme, whose love had become both a source of strength and a potential weakness that could be exploited by their enemies. Their stolen moments together, snatched between battles and political crises, were made all the more precious by their rarity. The apartment on Coruscant, where they could briefly pretend to be a normal couple, away from the responsibilities that defined their public lives, became a sanctuary in a galaxy that seemed determined to tear them apart. The rooms they shared, decorated with artifacts from Naboo and mementos from their separate lives, represented a vision of the life they might have had in a different galaxy, one where love was not forbidden and where the demands of duty did not constantly threaten to separate them. The holographic fireplace that provided warmth without flame, the comfortable furniture that had been chosen for its ability to accommodate quiet conversations, the windows that looked out over the endless cityscape of Coruscant, all combined to create a space that felt removed from the larger conflicts that consumed their world. Padme's work in the Senate, where she continued to advocate for peaceful solutions even as the war raged around her, put her at odds with those who had embraced the military approach to the crisis. Her speeches calling for negotiations with the Separatists and warning of the dangers of unlimited executive power were often dismissed as naive idealism by colleagues who had been hardened by years of conflict. Yet her voice remained one of the few in the government that remembered what the Republic had stood for before the war transformed it into something unrecognizable. The Senate chamber itself, once a place where the voices of 1,000 worlds could be heard in harmonious debate, had become an echo chamber where the Chancellor's policies were endorsed with mechanical regularity. The pods that had once carried representatives passionate about their constituents' welfare now housed beings who had learned that survival depended on conformity rather than conviction. The revelation of her pregnancy, discovered in the final months of the conflict, brought both joy and terror to the young couple. The prospect of bringing new life into a galaxy consumed by war was daunting enough, but the knowledge that their child would be born into a world where the Jedi Code forbade the very love that had created it added another layer of complexity to their situation. The dreams that began to plague Anakin, visions of Padmé's death in childbirth, became an obsession that would ultimately drive him to make choices that would damn the galaxy to darkness. The medical facility where they had learned of the pregnancy, with its sterile corridors and mechanical efficiency, had seemed like a place of hope and new beginnings. Yet the news that should have brought them joy instead brought fear, for they both understood that their secret could not be kept forever. The child growing within Padmé represented both the future they dreamed of and the catastrophe that would destroy everything they had worked to build. The hunt for General Grievous, the cyborg commander, whose tactical brilliance had made him one of the most feared beings in the galaxy, became a priority for the Republic as the war entered its final phases. The creature that had once been a Kaleesh warrior named Kaimanjai Shiel had been transformed into a mechanical monster whose only purpose was the destruction of Jedi. His collection of lightsabers, taken from the bodies of knights he had killed in personal combat, was a grim reminder of the price that the war had exacted from the Order. Each lightsaber in Grievous's collection told a story of a life ended and a dream destroyed. The weapons, designed to be extensions of their wielder's connection to the Force, had been reduced to mere trophies in the hands of a being who could never understand their true significance. The fact that these sacred instruments were being used by a creature of pure hatred and malice was an insult that every Jedi felt personally. Grievous's stronghold on Utapau, a world of sinkholes and underground cities where the native population had adapted to life in the planet's depths, became the site of one of the war's final major battles. The planet's surface, scarred by millennia of geological activity, provided the perfect hiding place for a being who had learned to survive through cunning and brutality. The native Pauans, tall and elegant beings who had adapted to life in the planet's caverns, found themselves caught between the Separatist forces and the Republic army that had come to liberate them. The underground cities of Utapau, with their organic architecture and multiple levels connected by winding passages, created a maze-like environment where conventional military tactics were useless. The Republic forces, designed for large-scale battles on open terrain, found themselves fighting a different kind of war in the planet's depths. Each level cleared, each passage secured, required the kind of individual heroism that no amount of training could fully prepare soldiers for. Obi-Wan Kenobi's pursuit of Grievous through the winding passages of Paw City was a dance of death between two beings who represented different philosophies of warfare. The Jedi Master, whose style emphasized defense and patience, found himself facing an opponent whose 4 arms could wield lightsabers with inhuman speed and precision. The duel that followed, fought on platforms suspended over chasms that descended into the planet's molten core, was a testament to the different paths that the war had forced upon its participants. The political maneuvering that continued even as the military conflict raged demonstrated the extent to which the war had corrupted the Republic's democratic institutions. Chancellor Palpatine, whose emergency powers had been granted as a temporary measure to deal with the crisis, had gradually accumulated authority that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Each new crisis, each military setback, provided justification for additional powers that centralized control in the hands of a single individual. The Senate, once a deliberative body where representatives from across the galaxy could debate the issues of the day, had become little more than a rubber stamp for decisions that had already been made in the Chancellor's office. The emergency sessions, called to address the latest military crisis, followed a predictable pattern of speeches followed by votes that rarely challenged the executive's proposals. The senators who had once prided themselves on their independence now found themselves reduced to the role of spectators in their own government. Yet, even as the Republic's democratic institutions crumbled, there were those who recognized the danger and attempted to preserve what they could of the old system. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan, whose quiet dignity and unwavering principles had made him one of the most respected members of the Senate, began to organize like-minded colleagues who shared his concerns about the concentration of power in the Chancellor's hands. Their meetings, held in secure locations away from the prying eyes of the Chancellor's growing intelligence apparatus, laid the groundwork for the resistance movement that would eventually challenge the Empire. As the war ground on, consuming resources and lives with mechanical efficiency, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the outcome of the conflict, but the future of the galaxy itself. The choices made in the coming days would echo through generations, shaping the destiny of countless worlds and determining whether the light of freedom would continue to shine or be extinguished by the darkness that had been growing in the shadows throughout the conflict. The galaxy trembled on the precipice of transformation as the Clone Wars entered their final, apocalyptic phase. 3 years of conflict had reshaped the very fabric of civilization, turning worlds that had known millennia of peace into battlegrounds where the future of freedom itself hung in the balance. The Republic, once a beacon of democracy and justice, had become a military machine whose appetite for war seemed insatiable, while the Separatist alliance, driven to desperation by countless defeats, prepared for one final gambit that would either secure their independence or ensure their complete destruction. Above the glittering cityscape of Coruscant, where the lights of 1 trillion beings created a constellation that rivaled the stars themselves, the largest space battle in galactic history was about to unfold. The capital world, seat of the Republic's government and home to the Jedi Temple, had been considered inviolate for 1,000 years. Yet now, as separatist warships emerged from hyperspace like predators descending upon their prey, the impossible had become reality. The war had finally come to the heart of the Republic itself. General Grievous, the cyborg commander, whose very name had become synonymous with death and destruction, had orchestrated this audacious assault with the mechanical precision that had made him the most feared being in the galaxy. His flagship, the Invisible Hand, was a massive vessel whose hull bore the scars of countless battles and whose weapons had reduced entire fleets to floating debris. The ship's bridge, where the general stood surrounded by tactical droids and holographic displays showing the unfolding battle, was a testament to the marriage of organic cunning and mechanical efficiency that had made him so deadly. The prize that Grievous sought was not the conquest of Coruscant itself, for even his considerable forces were insufficient for such an undertaking. Instead, he had come for a single individual whose capture would deal a devastating blow to Republic morale and provide the Separatists with a bargaining chip of incalculable value. Chancellor Palpatine, the democratically elected leader, whose emergency powers had transformed him into the most powerful being in the galaxy, was aboard the General's flagship, held in a chamber that had been specially designed to contain even a Force-sensitive prisoner. The irony of the situation was lost on all but a few. The Chancellor, who had secretly orchestrated the war from both sides, now found himself apparently at the mercy of the very forces he had helped create. His capture, staged with the same careful attention to detail that had marked every aspect of his grand design, would serve multiple purposes in the complex game he had been playing for decades. The rescue mission that followed was a testament to the courage and skill that had made Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi legends throughout the galaxy. Their starfighters, sleek vessels that danced through the battle like living things, weaved between the massive capital ships whose weapons lit up the space around Coruscant with deadly fire. The two Jedi, master and former apprentice, had developed a fighting style that bordered on telepathic, their movements synchronized through years of shared combat, and a bond that transcended the normal relationship between teacher and student. Anakin's piloting, enhanced by his connection to the Force and his instinctive understanding of machinery, defied every law of physics and probability. His fighter spun through formations of enemy ships with a grace that made seasoned pilots weep with envy, while his weapons found their targets with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. The young knight had grown into his power over the years of war, his abilities expanding in ways that both thrilled and troubled those who witnessed them. Obi-Wan, flying beside his former Padawan, with the steady precision that had made him one of the Order's most reliable knights, provided the balance and tactical thinking that complemented Anakin's raw talent. His approach to combat was methodical rather than instinctive, each move calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum risk. The contrast between their styles was evident in every maneuver, yet together they formed a combination that had proven unstoppable on countless battlefields. The infiltration of the invisible hand required all the skills that years of war had taught them. The ship's corridors, filled with battle droids and automated defenses, became a maze of death where only the Force-enhanced reflexes of the Jedi allowed them to survive. Each step forward was won through lightsaber combat that pushed their abilities to the limit, while the ship's structure groaned around them under the stress of the ongoing battle. The rescue of the Chancellor from his ornate prison chamber was complicated by the presence of Count Dooku, the former Jedi whose fall to the dark side had made him one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. The elegant noble, whose silver hair and patrician features spoke of a refinement that had been corrupted by decades of exposure to the Sith arts, awaited them in a chamber that had been designed as much for ceremony as for combat. The lightsaber duel that followed was a clash between different generations of Jedi training and philosophy. Dooku's style, refined through decades of practice and enhanced by his connection to the dark side, was a thing of deadly beauty. His curved-hilt lightsaber, a weapon that had been crafted to complement his fencing-inspired technique, moved with the precision of a master swordsman whose every gesture was calculated to achieve maximum effect. Obi-Wan's approach to the duel was defensive, his Form 3 technique designed to turn his opponent's aggression against him. The master had perfected his style through years of combat, creating an almost impenetrable defense that had saved his life on countless occasions. Yet against an opponent of Dooku's skill and power, defense alone was insufficient, and the Count's lightning-fast strikes eventually found their mark. The sight of his master falling, injured but not killed, triggered something primal in Anakin's nature. The young knight's fighting style, already aggressive by Jedi standards, became something approaching berserker fury. His blue lightsaber became a weapon of pure destruction, each strike powered by emotions that the Jedi Code warned against, but that the heat of combat made impossible to suppress. The duel's conclusion was swift and brutal. Dooku, caught off guard by the sudden change in his opponent's fighting style, found himself disarmed and at the mercy of a young man whose eyes burned with barely contained rage. The Count's elegant hands, severed by Anakin's lightsaber, fell to the floor like discarded gloves, while the man himself crumpled to his knees in defeat. It was in that moment of victory that the true test began. Chancellor Palpatine, seemingly helpless in his restraints, whispered words that would echo through eternity. The old man's voice, weak and strained by his supposed ordeal, carried a poison more deadly than any weapon. His suggestion that Dooku deserved death for his crimes, that justice demanded execution rather than capture, struck at the very heart of the Jedi philosophy. The execution of Count Dooku, carried out by a Jedi Knight at the urging of the Republic's leader, was a moment that would haunt Anakin for the rest of his days. The unarmed prisoner, helpless and defeated, had been killed not in the heat of battle but in cold blood. The act violated every principle that the Jedi held sacred, yet it had been committed by one of their own at the behest of the man they had sworn to protect. The escape from the invisible hand, as the massive vessel broke apart under the combined assault of the Republic fleet, was a harrowing experience that tested every skill the three men possessed. The ship's corridors, already damaged by the battle, became a maze of collapsing bulkheads and failing life support systems. Each step toward the hangar bay was a race against time, as the vessel's structural integrity failed and explosive decompression threatened to claim them all. General Grievous, the cyborg commander, whose presence had made the ship such a formidable weapon, had already fled to fight another day. His escape, accomplished through the kind of tactical brilliance that had made him legendary, ensured that the war would continue despite the loss of his flagship. The general's survival was a reminder that victory, no matter how complete it seemed, was always temporary in a conflict that had consumed the galaxy for 3 years. The return to Coruscant's surface brought with it a reunion that was both joyful and fraught with hidden dangers. Padme Amidala, now visibly pregnant with the child that would reshape the galaxy's destiny, awaited Anakin's return with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Their embrace, conducted in the privacy of her apartment while the city celebrated the rescue of the Chancellor, was a moment of intimacy in a galaxy that had forgotten what peace felt like. The revelation of Padme's pregnancy had brought both joy and terror to the young couple. The prospect of bringing new life into a galaxy consumed by war was daunting enough, but the knowledge that their child would be born into a world where the Jedi Code forbade the very love that had created it added another layer of complexity to their situation. The dreams that had begun to plague Anakin, visions of Padme's death in childbirth, became an obsession that would ultimately drive him to make choices that would damn the galaxy to darkness. The medical facility where they had learned of the pregnancy, with its sterile corridors and mechanical efficiency, had seemed like a place of hope and new beginnings. Yet the news that should have brought them joy instead brought fear, for they both understood that their secret could not be kept forever. The child growing within Padme represented both the future they dreamed of and the catastrophe that would destroy everything they had worked to build. The political situation on Coruscant had evolved during the battle, with the Chancellor's supposed capture and rescue serving to consolidate his power in ways that would have been impossible through normal legislative processes. The Senate, already weakened by years of emergency measures, found itself faced with a leader who had supposedly risked everything for the Republic's survival. The sympathy and support that flowed toward Palpatine in the wake of his ordeal provided the perfect cover for the next phase of his transformation. The Jedi Council, meeting in their chambers high above the city's surface, found themselves facing a dilemma that would test their wisdom and their commitment to the principles that had guided them for millennia. The war was entering its final phases, with the Separatist leadership scattered and their military forces in disarray. Yet the very success of the Republic's war effort had created new problems that the Council was ill-equipped to address. The relationship between the Jedi and the Chancellor had grown increasingly strained as the war progressed. Palpatine's accumulation of power, justified by the emergency conditions that the conflict had created, had begun to concern even those who had initially supported his expanded authority. The Jedi, trained to sense deception and corruption, had begun to perceive something troubling in the Chancellor's presence, though none yet suspected the true scope of his deception. Master Windu, whose stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to the Jedi Code had made him one of the Order's most respected leaders, had become the focal point for the Council's growing concerns about the Chancellor's intentions. The Master's purple lightsaber, a weapon that reflected his unique position between the light and dark sides of the Force, had been drawn in defense of the Republic countless times during the war. Yet now he found himself contemplating the possibility that the Republic's greatest enemy might not be the Separatists, but the man who led them. The assignment to spy on the Chancellor, a task that violated every principle of trust and honor that the Jedi held sacred, was given to Anakin with a kind of reluctance that spoke to the Council's desperation. The young knight, whose friendship with Palpatine had developed over years of war and political crisis, was the only Jedi who had the access and opportunity to observe the Chancellor's private moments. Yet the request itself was a sign of how far the war had corrupted the Order's values. Anakin's acceptance of the assignment, driven by his loyalty to the Jedi and his growing concerns about the Chancellor's intentions, marked the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The young knight, already struggling with the conflict between his love for Padme and his commitment to the Jedi Code, now found himself caught between his loyalty to his friend and his duty to the Order that had raised him. The revelation of Palpatine's true identity came not through careful investigation but through the Chancellor's own words. The meeting in the Chancellor's office, where the older man revealed himself to be Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who had orchestrated the war from both sides, was a moment that shattered Anakin's understanding of everything he had believed about the conflict and his place in it. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of manipulation, with Palpatine using every tool at his disposal to convince Anakin that the Jedi were the true enemies of peace and justice. The Chancellor's arguments, carefully crafted to exploit the young knight's fears and desires, painted a picture of a galaxy where the Sith offered the only path to the power necessary to save those he loved. The promise of the ability to prevent death, to use the dark side of the Force to save Padme from the fate that haunted Anakin's dreams, was the key that unlocked the young knight's resistance. The Sith arts, forbidden by the Jedi for their corrupting influence, offered what the light side could not: the power to impose one's will upon the universe itself. The temptation was too great for a young man who had already seen too much death, and who could not bear the thought of losing the woman he loved. The confrontation in the Chancellor's office between Mace Windu and Darth Sidious was a battle between the light and dark sides of the Force that had been building for years. The Jedi Master, accompanied by fellow council members whose skills had been honed through decades of training, faced an opponent whose power had been hidden behind the mask of political leadership for so long that even the wisest of the Jedi had failed to detect it. The lightsaber duel that followed was brief but decisive. Sidious, his true nature finally revealed, fought with the fury of a being who had suppressed his natural instincts for decades. His red lightsaber, a weapon that had been hidden away for years while he played the role of a benevolent leader, moved with the speed and precision of a master swordsman whose skills had been refined through centuries of Sith training. The death of the Jedi Masters, cut down by the Sith Lord's blade with casual efficiency, was a testament to the power that the dark side could grant to those willing to embrace it. Each fallen Jedi represented centuries of training and wisdom lost, while their killer seemed to grow stronger with each life he claimed. The survivors of the initial assault found themselves facing an opponent whose power seemed to have no limits. Anakin's arrival at the crucial moment when Mace Windu held his lightsaber at the defeated Sith Lord's throat created a choice that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The young knight, torn between his loyalty to the Jedi and his fear for Padme's life, found himself at the center of a moment that would echo through eternity. The Chancellor's apparent helplessness, his pleas for mercy that masked his true intentions, struck at the heart of Anakin's confusion and desperation. The decision to intervene, to prevent Master Windu from striking down the Sith Lord, was made in a moment of passion rather than reason. Anakin's lightsaber, the weapon that had served him faithfully throughout the war, became the instrument of his master's death. The severed hand that fell to the floor, still gripping the purple blade that had been its owner's pride, was a symbol of the choice that could never be undone. The transformation of Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader was not the dramatic physical change that would come later, but a spiritual death that left his body intact while destroying his soul. The young knight who had dreamed of adventure among the stars, who had risked everything to save those he loved, who had fought for justice and peace throughout the galaxy, died in that moment of betrayal. What remained was a being driven by fear and anger, a servant of the dark side, who would do anything to protect the illusion of power that had been promised to him. The execution of Order 66, transmitted to clone commanders across the galaxy through secure channels that had been built into their communication systems from the beginning, was the culmination of a plan that had been in motion for decades. The simple phrase, spoken with the authority of the Republic's highest office, transformed loyal soldiers into instruments of betrayal. The inhibitor chips, hidden within the clones' brains and activated by the Chancellor's command, overrode years of friendship and loyalty with mechanical precision. The Jedi, scattered across the galaxy on missions that had seemed routine, found themselves suddenly surrounded by enemies where they had expected to find allies. The clone troopers who had fought beside them shared meals with them, risked their lives to protect them, turned their weapons on their commanders without hesitation or remorse. The systematic nature of the betrayal, its simultaneous execution across countless worlds, spoke to a level of planning and coordination that few could have imagined. On Maijito, Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, the Syrian Jedi, whose elongated skull housed a brain capable of processing complex tactical information, died in a hail of blaster fire from the clone troopers he had led into battle. His last moments, captured by security cameras and transmitted across the galaxy, showed a being who died not understanding why his most trusted allies had turned against him. On Felucia, Aayla Secura, the Twi'lek Jedi, whose beauty had made her a symbol of hope for her people, was cut down by the very soldiers she had been trying to protect. Her death, swift and brutal, was a reminder that the dark side made no distinctions between the innocent and the guilty. The jungle world where she fell, with its bioluminescent plants and exotic wildlife, became a tomb that held the remains of one of the Order's most promising knights. On Kashyyyk, Master Yoda, the ancient Jedi, whose wisdom had guided the Order for centuries, sensed the disturbance in the Force that accompanied the deaths of his fellow Jedi. The diminutive master, whose size had always been deceptive, found himself facing clone troopers whose programming had overridden their respect for his authority. His escape, accomplished through the kind of tactical brilliance that had made him legendary, was one of the few bright spots in a galaxy that had suddenly become much darker. The assault on the Jedi Temple, led by the newly christened Darth Vader and supported by the 501st Legion of clone troopers, was an act of such sacrilege that it seemed to wound the Force itself. The ancient building, which had stood for millennia as a symbol of peace and justice, became a battlefield where the defenders found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by forces that should have been their protectors. The massacre that followed was systematic and thorough. The Jedi Knights and Masters who had remained on Coruscant, including many who had been too old or too young to serve in the war, were hunted down and killed with mechanical efficiency. The temple's halls, which had echoed with the sounds of lightsaber training and philosophical debate for centuries, now rang with the screams of the dying and the mechanical march of clone troopers. The younglings, those children who had been brought to the temple to begin their training in the ways of the Force, were perhaps the most tragic victims of the Purge. Their deaths, carried out by the very man who had once been their protector, represented the complete corruption of everything the Jedi had stood for. The innocent faces that looked up at Vader with trust and confusion would haunt the galaxy for generations to come. The political transformation of the Republic into the Empire was accomplished with the same efficiency that had marked the military coup. The Senate, called into emergency session to deal with the supposed Jedi rebellion, found themselves faced with a Chancellor who had revealed his true nature as a Sith Lord. The transformation of Palpatine into Emperor Palpatine was accomplished not through force, but through the thunderous applause of senators who had forgotten what they were supposed to represent. The speech that accompanied the transformation was a masterpiece of political manipulation, using the fear and uncertainty created by the war to justify the abandonment of democratic principles. The Empire, as the new emperor described it, would bring order to a galaxy that had been weakened by the inefficiency and corruption of democratic governance. The Jedi, portrayed as traitors who had attempted to overthrow the legitimate government, were declared enemies of the state whose elimination was necessary for the survival of civilization itself. The senators who applauded the Empire's birth, their faces illuminated by the pale light of the Senate chamber, were witnessing the death of everything their predecessors had worked to build. The democracy that had endured for 1,000 years, survived countless crises, and brought peace to 1,000,000 worlds, died, not with violence, but with the voluntary surrender of those who had been elected to protect it. The final confrontation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader on the volcanic world of Mustafar was a battle between two men who had once been brothers in all but blood. The planet's surface, scarred by constant volcanic activity and bathed in the hellish glow of lava flows, provided a fitting backdrop for a duel that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The mining facility where they fought, built to extract precious metals from the planet's molten core, became a stage for the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. The lightsaber duel that followed was a dance of death between two masters whose styles had been forged through years of training together. Obi-Wan's defensive technique, refined through decades of combat, was perfectly suited to counter Vader's aggressive approach. Yet the dark side had given the fallen Jedi a power that his former master found difficult to match, and the battle's outcome remained uncertain until the very end. The turning point came when Vader's arrogance, fed by his newfound power and his belief in his own invincibility, led him to attempt a maneuver that Obi-Wan had taught him years earlier. The jump over his opponent's head, a technique that had served him well in countless battles, became his downfall when executed against a master who knew every aspect of his fighting style. The mutilation of Anakin Skywalker, his legs severed by Obi-Wan's lightsaber, and his body left to burn in the fires of Mustafar, was a fate worse than death. The young man who had dreamed of bringing peace to the galaxy found himself trapped in a hell of his own making, his body consumed by flames, while his spirit was consumed by the dark side of the Force. The birth of Luke and Leia Skywalker, occurring simultaneously with their father's transformation into the mechanical monster that would terrorize the galaxy, was a moment of hope in a time of despair. The children, born from the love between a Jedi and a senator, represented the possibility of redemption in a galaxy that had seemingly embraced darkness. Their separation, necessary for their protection but tragic in its implications, ensured that the legacy of both their parents would survive to influence future generations. Padmé's death, brought about not by the complications of childbirth, but by the breaking of her heart, was the final tragedy in a series of events that had transformed the galaxy. The woman who had fought for peace and justice throughout her life, who had believed in the power of love to overcome hatred, died knowing that the man she had loved had become the very evil she had spent her life opposing. The funeral on Naboo, where Padmé's body was laid to rest in the royal tomb that had been prepared for her years earlier, was attended by beings from across the galaxy who had been touched by her life and her sacrifice. The flowers that covered her coffin, brought from a dozen worlds where she had worked for peace, were a testament to the impact that one person could have on the galaxy when they chose to fight for what was right. The construction of the Death Star, the ultimate weapon that would symbolize the Empire's power and its willingness to use terror to maintain control, had begun in the secret shipyards that had been hidden throughout the galaxy. The massive space station, capable of destroying entire planets with a single shot, represented the culmination of the military philosophy that had emerged during the Clone Wars. The galaxy would no longer be ruled through consent but through fear, and the Death Star would be the instrument of that fear. As the first Imperial Star Destroyers began their patrols of the galaxy, their triangular hulls casting shadows over worlds that had once known freedom, the age of the Empire had begun. The Jedi were extinct, democracy was dead, and the galaxy found itself ruled by a Sith Lord whose power seemed absolute. Yet even in the darkness, seeds of hope remained, scattered across the stars, like the light of distant suns, waiting for the day when they would grow into something that could challenge the darkness and restore the light to a galaxy that had forgotten what freedom meant. In the immediate aftermath of Order 66, as the galaxy reeled from the systematic extermination of the Jedi Order and the transformation of the Republic into the Empire, there emerged from the shadows a group of clone troopers who had somehow resisted the programming that had turned their brothers into instruments of betrayal. Clone Force 99, known throughout the clone army as the Bad Batch, represented an anomaly in the carefully controlled system that had created the Grand Army of the Republic. These 4 clones, each bearing genetic mutations that had altered their abilities and personalities in ways that the Kaminoan cloners had never intended, found themselves uniquely positioned to witness the galaxy's transformation from a perspective that few others could share. Their enhanced abilities, which had made them outcasts among their more conventional brothers, now became the very traits that allowed them to resist the imperial conditioning that had claimed so many of their fellow soldiers. Hunter, the squad's leader, possessed enhanced senses that allowed him to track targets across vast distances and detect dangers that would remain invisible to normal beings. His heightened awareness of his surroundings had made him an invaluable asset during the Clone Wars, but it also meant that he experienced the galaxy's transformation with an intensity that few could imagine. The screams of dying Jedi, the mechanical precision of Order 66's execution, the subtle changes in his brother's behavior, all registered with a clarity that was both a gift and a curse. Tech, whose enhanced cognitive abilities had made him the squad's technical specialist, possessed an understanding of systems and technology that bordered on the supernatural. His ability to interface with computers and machinery had proven invaluable during countless missions, but it also allowed him to perceive the hidden programming that had been built into the clone army's command structure. The discovery of the inhibitor chips, those microscopic devices that had been implanted in every clone's brain, revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had created and controlled the army. Wrecker, the squad's demolitions expert, had been gifted with enhanced strength and size that made him a formidable warrior in close combat. His childlike enthusiasm for destruction had made him a beloved figure among his brothers, but his intellectual limitations meant that he struggled to understand the political implications of the galaxy's transformation. The simple loyalty that had defined his relationship with his squadmates became his anchor in a universe that seemed determined to tear apart everything he had believed in. Crosshair, the squad's sniper, possessed enhanced eyesight and reflexes that made him one of the most deadly marksmen in the clone army. His ability to make impossible shots had saved his squadmates' lives on countless occasions, but his cold, calculating nature had always set him apart from his more emotional brothers. The activation of his inhibitor chip, which had somehow remained functional while his squadmates had failed, created a division within the squad that would test the bonds of brotherhood that had sustained them through years of war. The 5th member of their group was not a clone at all, but a young girl whose existence challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about the Kaminoan cloning process. Omega, an unaltered female clone who possessed the genetic template of Jango Fett without the modifications that had created the clone army, represented a living link to the original genetic material from which millions of soldiers had been created. Her presence among the Bad Batch was both a blessing and a complication, for her youth and innocence stood in stark contrast to the harsh realities of a galaxy that had suddenly become much more dangerous. The destruction of Kamino, the ocean world where the clone army had been created, marked the end of an era that had defined the galaxy for over a decade. The Imperial forces, under the command of Admiral Rampart, had come not to celebrate the cloning facilities that had served the Republic so faithfully, but to eliminate evidence of the Empire's origins and to ensure that no one could challenge the New Order's version of history. The cloning facilities that had once produced soldiers by the millions were systematically destroyed, their laboratories and incubation chambers reduced to rubble that would sink beneath the planet's endless oceans. The Kaminoan cloners, whose scientific expertise had made the clone army possible, were either eliminated or forced into hiding, their knowledge deemed too dangerous to be allowed to survive in the new Imperial Order. The cities of Kamino, with their organic architecture and transparent walls that had allowed their inhabitants to observe the endless storms that raged across the planet's surface, were abandoned to the elements. The platforms that had risen from the ocean like artificial islands were left to be reclaimed by the waters that had surrounded them, their advanced technology becoming relics of a time when the galaxy had still believed in the possibility of peace through strength. The Bad Batch's escape from Kamino, accomplished through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of improvised tactics that had made them legendary during the Clone Wars, marked the beginning of a new chapter in their story. No longer soldiers in an army that had a clear mission and defined objectives, they found themselves adrift in a galaxy that had no place for beings like them. Their ship, the Marauder, became not just a means of transportation, but a home for a family that had been bound together by something stronger than genetics or programming. The mercenary work that sustained them during the early days of the Empire was a far cry from the noble cause they had served during the Clone Wars. The jobs they took, ranging from simple protection details to complex infiltration missions, brought them into contact with beings from across the galaxy who were struggling to adapt to the new Imperial Order. Each assignment taught them something new about the galaxy they now inhabited, a universe where the rule of law had been replaced by the rule of force. Sid, the Trandoshan information broker, who became their primary employer, operated from a cantina on the planet Ord Mantell that served as a hub for the kind of beings who thrived in the galaxy's gray areas. The establishment, with its dim lighting and constant cloud of smoke, was a place where information was currency and loyalty was a luxury that few could afford. The deals that were struck in its shadowy booths shaped the fate of worlds, while the beings who frequented it remained anonymous figures whose true identities were known only to themselves. The relationship between the Bad Batch and Sid was one of mutual convenience rather than trust. The Trandoshan's network of contacts and informants provided them with the work they needed to survive, while their unique skills allowed her to take on jobs that would have been impossible for conventional mercenaries. The arrangement suited both parties, yet it was always understood that their alliance would last only as long as it served their respective interests. The Imperial transition from clone troopers to recruited stormtroopers was a process that the Bad Batch witnessed firsthand as they traveled across the galaxy. The new soldiers, drawn from the general population rather than created in laboratories, lacked the genetic modifications and intensive training that had made the clone army so effective. Their white armor, while visually similar to that worn by the clones, concealed beings whose loyalty had been earned through propaganda rather than programming. The training facilities where these new stormtroopers learned their trade were monuments to the Empire's industrial approach to military service. The academies that had once produced officers for the Republic Navy were transformed into factories for the mass production of soldiers whose primary qualification was their willingness to follow orders without question. The individuality that had made the clone troopers effective was seen as a liability in the new Imperial Order, where conformity was valued above competence. The veterans of the Clone Wars, those clone troopers who had survived the transition and remained in Imperial service, found themselves increasingly marginalized as the Empire's military philosophy evolved. Their experience and tactical knowledge, which had been invaluable during the war, was viewed with suspicion by Imperial commanders who preferred the predictable mediocrity of recruited soldiers to the proven effectiveness of genetically enhanced warriors. The accelerated aging process that had been built into the clone troopers' genetic template began to take its toll during the early years of the Empire. The soldiers who had been created as young adults in the final years of the Republic were now aging at twice the normal rate, their bodies breaking down under the stress of genetic modifications that had been designed for short-term military service rather than long-term survival. The medical facilities that had been established to care for aging clone troopers were inadequate for the scope of the problem, and many veterans found themselves abandoned by the government they had served so faithfully. The sight of former soldiers begging in the streets of imperial cities became a common reminder of the Empire's callous disregard for those who had outlived their usefulness. The Bad Batch's encounters with these aging veterans were among the most poignant moments of their journey through the early imperial period. The recognition that passed between them when they met their former brothers was a reminder of the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of war, yet it was also a harbinger of the fate that awaited them all if they remained in imperial service. The hunt for surviving Jedi, which had become a priority for the Empire's security forces, brought the Bad Batch into contact with beings who had once been their commanders and allies. The Inquisitors, former Jedi who had been corrupted by the dark side and trained to hunt their former comrades, represented the ultimate perversion of everything the Jedi Order had stood for. Their red lightsabers, weapons that had been corrupted by the dark side, were symbols of the Empire's ability to turn even the most noble beings into instruments of oppression. The few Jedi who had survived the initial purge found themselves hunted not just by Imperial forces, but by beings who understood their methods and weaknesses better than any conventional soldier could. The Inquisitors' knowledge of lightsaber combat and force techniques made them deadly opponents for any surviving Jedi, while their willingness to use the dark side gave them access to powers that their former comrades would not employ. The Bad Batch's first encounter with a surviving Jedi was a reminder of the bonds that had been forged during the Clone Wars, yet it was also a test of their loyalty to their former commanders versus their need to survive in the new Imperial Order. The decision to help rather than capture the Jedi marked a turning point in their journey, transforming them from neutral mercenaries into active opponents of the Empire they had once served. The network of safe houses and hidden bases that had been established to help surviving Jedi and other enemies of the Empire was a testament to the courage of ordinary beings who were willing to risk everything to preserve some small measure of freedom in a galaxy that had embraced tyranny. The pilots, mechanics, and smugglers who maintained these networks were the unsung heroes of the early resistance, their anonymous contributions laying the groundwork for the rebellion that would eventually challenge the Empire's power. The children who had been identified as Force-sensitive during the Clone Wars became particular targets for Imperial forces, their potential seen as a threat that had to be eliminated before it could mature into active resistance. The programs that had been established to train these younglings as Jedi were dismantled, their students either killed or recruited into Imperial service as Inquisitors. The loss of an entire generation of Force-sensitive beings was a tragedy that would echo through the galaxy for decades to come. Omega's growth from a sheltered laboratory creation into a skilled member of the Bad Batch was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dark period. Her natural curiosity and eagerness to learn provided a counterpoint to the cynicism that had begun to affect her adoptive family, while her unique genetic heritage made her a living link to the clone army's origins. The bond that developed between her and her protectors was a reminder that family was not defined by genetics but by the choices that beings made to care for one another. The training that Omega received from her squadmates covered not just military skills but the kind of practical knowledge that was necessary for survival in a galaxy where the rule of law had been replaced by the rule of force. Each lesson in marksmanship, infiltration, or technical systems was also a lesson in the values that had sustained the Bad Batch through their transformation from soldiers to outcasts. The Imperial propaganda machine, which had been refined during the Clone Wars and perfected during the early years of the Empire, worked tirelessly to reshape the galaxy's understanding of recent history. The narrative that emerged painted the Jedi as traitors who had attempted to overthrow the legitimate government, while the Emperor was portrayed as a benevolent leader who had saved the galaxy from chaos and destruction. The holonet broadcasts that reached every corner of the galaxy carried messages of unity and order, their carefully crafted scripts designed to convince viewers that the Empire represented the natural evolution of galactic civilization. The news reports that documented the Empire's achievements rarely mentioned the cost of those accomplishments, while the suffering of those who opposed the new order was dismissed as the inevitable consequence of resisting progress. The cultural changes that accompanied the Empire's rise were subtle but pervasive. The art and literature that had flourished during the Republic's golden age were replaced by works that celebrated imperial values, while the diversity of expression that had characterized galactic civilization was gradually homogenized into a single, approved narrative. The languages, customs, and traditions that had defined countless worlds were suppressed in favor of a standardized imperial culture that left no room for deviation. The economic transformation that accompanied the Empire's political changes was equally dramatic. The trade routes that had connected the galaxy's markets were reorganized to serve imperial needs, while the resources that had once been shared among member worlds were redirected to support the Empire's military expansion. The prosperity that had defined the Republic's golden age was replaced by a system that concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, while leaving the majority of the galaxy's population struggling to survive. The Bad Batch's journey through this transformed galaxy was an education in the realities of imperial rule, each mission teaching them something new about the system they had once served. The worlds they visited, from the core systems that had embraced the Empire to the outer rim territories that chafed under imperial control, provided a comprehensive view of the galaxy's new order and the resistance that was already beginning to form in response to it. The moral choices that faced the Bad Batch during their mercenary period were more complex than any they had encountered during the Clone Wars. The clear distinction between right and wrong that had defined their service to the Republic was replaced by a spectrum of gray areas where survival often required compromises that challenged their fundamental beliefs about duty and honor. The family they had created among themselves, bound together by shared experiences and mutual loyalty, became their moral compass in a galaxy that seemed to have lost its way. The decisions they made were guided not by abstract principles, but by their commitment to protecting one another and preserving the values that had sustained them through their transformation from soldiers to outcasts. As the Empire consolidated its power, and the last vestiges of the Republic disappeared into history, the Bad Batch found themselves evolving from neutral observers to active participants in the resistance that was beginning to form. Their unique skills and insider knowledge of imperial methods made them valuable allies for those who sought to challenge the new order, while their commitment to family and freedom provided the moral foundation for their transformation from mercenaries to rebels. The galaxy that had been transformed by 3 years of war was now entering a period of oppression that would test the courage and determination of every being who still believed in the possibility of freedom. The Bad Batch, once outcasts in an army of conformists, now found themselves among the few who possessed both the skills and the will to challenge the darkness that had descended upon the stars. Their journey from soldiers to mercenaries to rebels was a microcosm of the larger transformation that was taking place throughout the galaxy, as ordinary beings discovered that sometimes the greatest act of heroism was simply refusing to accept that evil had triumphed forever. In the industrial shipyards of Corellia, where the Empire's war machine consumed the dreams of countless young beings who had once looked to the stars with hope, a different kind of legend was being born. The planet's surface, scarred by centuries of heavy industry and now fully dedicated to the production of imperial vessels, served as a prison for those unlucky enough to be born into its grinding poverty. Here, in the shadows of the massive construction yards where star destroyers took shape like metallic leviathans, the criminal underworld had carved out territories that existed beyond the reach of imperial law. Han Solo had grown up in these streets, his childhood shaped by the harsh realities of survival in a system that cared nothing for the weak or the poor. The young man, barely 20 years old, but already possessing the kind of street wisdom that came from a lifetime of dodging Imperial patrols and criminal enforcers, had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of Corellia's underworld with the same instinctive grace that would later make him one of the galaxy's most famous pilots. The speeder chase through Corellia's industrial districts was a testament to Pan's natural piloting abilities, his stolen vehicle weaving through traffic and obstacles with a precision that defied the laws of physics. The Imperial patrol speeders that pursued him, their drivers trained in the methodical efficiency that characterized all Imperial operations, found themselves outmaneuvered by a young man whose understanding of his vehicle's capabilities bordered on the supernatural. Kira, the young woman whose beauty and intelligence had made her both Han's closest companion and his greatest weakness, represented everything that was both wonderful and terrible about life in the galaxy's criminal underworld. Her survival skills, honed through years of serving Lady Proxima and her White Worm gang, had taught her to hide her true feelings behind a mask of calculated indifference. Yet beneath that carefully constructed exterior lay a warmth and vulnerability that Han had glimpsed during their rare moments of privacy. The relationship between Han and Kira was complicated by the brutal realities of their environment, where emotional attachment was a luxury that few could afford. Their love, genuine but constrained by the necessity of survival, was conducted in stolen moments between the dangerous assignments that defined their daily existence. Each shared glance, each brief touch, each whispered conversation carried the weight of feelings that could not be openly expressed in a world where weakness was punished by death. Lady Proxima, the grotesque crime lord whose serpentine form dominated the sewers beneath Corellia's industrial districts, had built her empire on the exploitation of the young and desperate. The White Worm gang, named for their leader's pale, writhing appearance, operated with the kind of brutal efficiency that had made them one of the planet's most feared criminal organizations. The children who served her, including Han and Kira, were treated as disposable assets whose only value lay in their willingness to risk their lives for the promise of food and shelter. The escape attempt that separated Han from Kira was a moment of tragedy disguised as triumph, the young man's freedom purchased with the abandonment of the person he loved most. The Imperial checkpoint that stood between them and their dreams of a better life became the barrier that would define both their destinies, forcing Han to make a choice that would haunt him for years to come. The Imperial Recruitment Center on Corellia, a gleaming monument to the Empire's ability to transform individual desperation into military might, processed thousands of young beings each day. The promises of glory and advancement that adorned its walls were carefully crafted to appeal to those who had known only poverty and oppression, offering them the chance to serve something greater than themselves while escaping the circumstances of their birth. Han's decision to join the Imperial Navy was born not of patriotism, but of necessity, his enlistment representing the only legal path off a world that had become a prison. The uniform he received, crisp and clean in a way that contrasted sharply with the tattered clothing of his civilian life, was both a symbol of his new beginning and a reminder of the price he had paid for his freedom. The Imperial Academy on Carida, where Han received his training as a pilot, was an institution designed to strip away individual identity and replace it with unquestioning loyalty to the Empire. The instructors, veterans of the Clone Wars who had adapted to the new Imperial Order, sought to mold their students into the kind of efficient, obedient officers that the Empire required. The training regimen, designed to break down personal attachments and rebuild them as dedication to the state, was a process that many students found impossible to endure. Han's natural rebelliousness, the same trait that had made him a successful thief on Corellia, made him a poor candidate for the kind of mindless obedience that the Academy demanded. His questions about orders that seemed unnecessarily cruel, his reluctance to abandon the personal relationships that had sustained him through his difficult youth, his tendency to find creative solutions to problems that were supposed to have only one correct answer, all marked him as a potential troublemaker in the eyes of his instructors. The Imperial War on Mimban, a muddy, miserable world where the Empire's forces were engaged in a grinding campaign against local insurgents, provided Han with his first real taste of the brutality that lay beneath the Empire's civilized facade. The planet's surface, shrouded in perpetual mist and scarred by the detritus of industrial warfare, was a hellscape where young soldiers were sent to die for reasons that few of them understood. The mud troopers who fought on Mimban's surface were the Empire's expendable infantry, soldiers whose lives were considered so worthless that they were equipped with outdated armor and inadequate weapons. The campaign they fought, officially described as a peacekeeping operation, was in reality a war of extermination designed to crush any resistance to Imperial rule. The casualties, dismissed in official reports as acceptable losses, represented the destruction of entire generations of young beings who had been sacrificed to maintain the Empire's grip on power. Han's desertion from the Imperial army, accomplished through a combination of luck and the kind of desperate courage that had sustained him throughout his youth, was both a liberation and a condemnation. The young man who had once dreamed of serving as a pilot in the Imperial Navy now found himself branded as a traitor, his face added to the databases of criminals and dissidents that the Empire maintained throughout the galaxy. The encounter with Chewbacca in the mud pits of Mimban was a meeting of two beings who had been abandoned by the systems they had once served. The Wookiee, whose noble bearing and impressive size marked him as a member of one of the galaxy's most respected species, had been reduced to the status of a beast of burden by Imperial forces who saw his people as nothing more than a source of slave labor. The friendship that developed between Han and Chewbacca transcended the normal boundaries of species and culture, two beings from vastly different backgrounds, finding common ground in their shared rejection of the Empire's tyranny. The life debt that Chewbacca swore to Han, a sacred obligation in Wookiee culture that bound him to protect the young human who had secured his freedom, was the beginning of a partnership that would last for decades. Tobias Beckett, the aging criminal whose weathered face and cynical demeanor spoke of decades spent in the galaxy's underworld, represented both the possibilities and the dangers of life outside the law. The man who had once been a legitimate actor performing in theaters across the galaxy had been transformed by circumstance and choice into one of the most skilled thieves and con artists in the Outer Rim. His crew, a carefully selected group of specialists whose complementary skills made them capable of almost any criminal enterprise, operated with the kind of professional efficiency that had made them legendary in certain circles. The job on Vandor, a frozen world where the Empire maintained a shipping depot for the refined coaxium fuel that powered their war machine, was designed to be a simple heist that would provide Beckett's crew with the resources they needed to retire from their dangerous profession. The convex train that carried the precious cargo through the planet's mountain passes was heavily guarded, its Imperial escort aware that the fuel they protected was worth more than the gross domestic product of most star systems. The attack on the train, conducted from Cloud Riders mounted on speeder bikes that could navigate the treacherous mountain terrain, was a masterpiece of criminal planning and execution. The precision required to board a moving vehicle while under fire from Imperial forces, the technical skill needed to detach the cargo containers without damaging their contents, the timing necessary to escape before reinforcements could arrive, all combined to create an operation that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The betrayal by Val and Rio, Beckett's longtime partners whose sacrifice ensured the mission's success, was a reminder of the price that was paid by those who chose to live outside the law. Their deaths, sudden and violent, transformed what should have been a moment of triumph into a tragedy that would haunt the survivors for years to come. The loss of the calcium shipment, destroyed when the train's cargo containers exploded in a chain reaction that lit up the mountain pass like a small sun, left Beckett and his surviving crew members in debt to some of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. The Crimson Dawn Syndicate, whose reach extended throughout the Outer Rim and whose methods made even hardened criminals nervous, was not known for their patience with those who failed to deliver on their promises. The planet Kessel, a desolate world where the Empire maintained some of its most brutal mining operations, had become synonymous with suffering and death throughout the galaxy. The spice mines that honeycombed the planet's surface were worked by slaves whose life expectancy was measured in months rather than years, their bodies broken by the harsh conditions and the toxic substances they were forced to extract from the rock. The Kessel Run, a hyperspace route that connected the mining world to the galaxy's major trade routes, was considered one of the most dangerous navigational challenges in known space. The gravitational anomalies and spatial distortions that characterized the route made it a graveyard for unwary pilots, their ships torn apart by forces that could not be detected until it was too late to avoid them. Lando Calrissian, the smooth-talking gambler whose charm and style had made him a legend in the galaxy's gambling houses, owned the Millennium Falcon through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of calculated risk-taking that had defined his entire life. The ship, a heavily modified YT-1300 light freighter, was both his home and his livelihood, its hidden compartments and upgraded systems a testament to his technical expertise and his understanding of what it took to survive in a galaxy where the law was often the enemy. The relationship between Lando and his droid companion Lion 337, a self-modified protocol droid whose artificial intelligence had evolved beyond its original programming, was a unique partnership that challenged conventional understanding of the relationship between organic and artificial life. The droid's advocacy for droid rights, her belief that artificial beings deserved the same freedoms as their organic creators, was a philosophy that put her at odds with a galaxy that viewed droids as property rather than people. The liberation of Kessel, accomplished through a combination of L-337's inspiring leadership and the desperate courage of beings who had nothing left to lose, was a moment of triumph that demonstrated the power of hope to overcome even the most oppressive circumstances. The sight of former slaves turning their tools into weapons, of mining droids joining the rebellion against their masters, of beings who had been reduced to the status of property reclaiming their dignity and freedom, was a reminder that the spirit of resistance could never be completely crushed. The destruction of Left 337 during the escape from Kessel was a tragedy that affected all who witnessed it. The droid's sacrifice ensuring that her companions could escape with their lives, while her own consciousness was uploaded into the Millennium Falcon's computer systems. Her final act, the integration of her personality into the ship's navigational systems, gave the vessel a unique character that would influence its behavior for decades to come. The record-breaking Kessel Run, completed in less than 12 parsecs through a combination of skilled piloting and desperate necessity, was a feat that would become legendary throughout the galaxy. The route that Han plotted through the dangerous gravitational fields surrounding the Maw cluster pushed both ship and crew to their absolute limits, their survival depending on split-second decisions and the kind of intuitive understanding of hyperspace that could not be taught in any academy. The revelation of Chira's transformation, from the young woman Han had loved on Corellia to the cold, calculating lieutenant of Dryden Voss, was a moment of heartbreak that would shape the young pilot's understanding of love and loss for the rest of his life. The person he had risked everything to save had become someone he barely recognized, her survival purchased through compromises that had changed her into something that bore little resemblance to the girl he had once known. Dryden Voss, the scarred crime lord, whose facial markings told the story of a life spent in violence and betrayal, represented the kind of sophisticated evil that thrived in the Empire's shadow. His yacht, a mobile headquarters that allowed him to conduct business throughout the galaxy while staying ahead of both Imperial forces and rival criminal organizations, was a testament to the wealth and power that could be accumulated by those willing to profit from others' suffering. The final confrontation aboard Voss's yacht, where loyalties were tested and betrayals were revealed, was a moment that demonstrated the complex moral landscape of the galaxy's criminal underworld. The battle that erupted when Han's deception was discovered was fought not just with weapons, but with the kind of emotional manipulation that had become second nature to those who survived in the shadows. The death of Dryden Voss, killed by the woman he had trusted most, was a reminder that in the galaxy's criminal hierarchy, loyalty was always conditional and betrayal was the ultimate currency. Keria's ascension to power within the Crimson Dawn organization, symbolized by her taking control of Voss's yacht and his communication systems, marked her complete transformation from victim to victimizer. The revelation of Darth Maul's survival, his scarred face and mechanical legs testimony to his encounter with Obi-Wan Kenobi years earlier, added a new dimension to the galaxy's criminal underworld. The former Sith apprentice, driven by hatred and a desire for revenge, had carved out a criminal empire that operated in the shadows of the larger conflict between the Empire and the growing rebellion. The final parting between Han and Qi'ra, conducted with the kind of emotional restraint that both had learned was necessary for survival, was a moment of loss that would resonate through both their lives. The woman who had once represented everything Han hoped to achieve had become a symbol of everything he had lost. Her choice to remain in the criminal underworld, a reminder that not all stories had happy endings. The acquisition of the Millennium Falcon won from Lando in a sabacc game that combined skill and luck in equal measure, gave Han both the freedom he had always sought and the means to pursue it. The ship, with its hidden compartments and upgraded systems, was perfectly suited to the kind of life he had chosen, its capabilities enhanced by the consciousness of Life 337 that still resided within its computer systems. The partnership between Han and Chewbacca, solidified through their shared experiences and mutual respect, represented the kind of loyalty that had become rare in a galaxy where betrayal was commonplace. The Wookiees' strength and technical expertise complemented Han's piloting skills and street wisdom, creating a team that would become legendary throughout the Outer Rim. The transformation of Han Solo from an idealistic young man who had believed in the possibility of love and redemption to a cynical smuggler who trusted no one but his Wookiee companion was a journey that reflected the galaxy's own descent into darkness. The Empire's oppression, the criminal underworld's corruption, and the personal betrayals he had experienced had combined to create a man who had learned to survive through self-reliance and careful calculation of risk and reward. Yet beneath the cynical exterior that Han had developed as protection against a hostile galaxy, there remained traces of the young man who had once been willing to risk everything for love. The capacity for heroism that would later make him a key figure in the rebellion against the Empire was already present, waiting for the right circumstances to call it forth. The galaxy that Han and Chewbacca now navigated as independent operators was a place where the Empire's rule was absolute but not complete, where criminal organizations provided the only alternative to imperial tyranny, and where individuals could still carve out small spaces of freedom through courage, skill, and the willingness to take risks that more cautious beings would never consider. The legend of Han Solo, the smuggler who could make the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, had begun to spread throughout the galaxy's cantinas and spaceports, creating a reputation that would open doors and attract enemies in equal measure. The young man who had once dreamed of escape from Corellia's industrial districts had become exactly what he had always wanted to be, yet the cost of that achievement was higher than he had ever imagined it would be. 10 years had passed since the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire, a decade of exile that had transformed Obi-Wan Kenobi from one of the galaxy's most celebrated Jedi Knights into a hermit haunted by the ghosts of his past. The twin suns of Tatooine blazed overhead with the same merciless intensity that had greeted him upon his arrival, their light casting long shadows across the desert that had become both his prison and his sanctuary. The cave where he had made his home, carved into the sandstone cliffs of the Jundland wastes, was a far cry from the elegant chambers he had once occupied in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The desert world that had once seemed like the edge of civilization had become the center of Obi-Wan's universe, its endless dunes and rocky outcroppings as familiar to him as the corridors of the temple had once been. The moisture farmers who scraped out meager existences from the planet's harsh environment had grown accustomed to the presence of the strange hermit they called Ben Kenobi, though few suspected that the weathered man who occasionally traded with them had once been one of the galaxy's most powerful warriors. The responsibility that had brought him to this desolate world weighed heavily on his shoulders, a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Luke Skywalker, the son of his former Padawan, lived with his uncle and aunt on a moisture farm not far from Obi-Wan's cave. The boy, now a young man of 19, possessed the same bright eyes and restless spirit that had once characterized his father, yet he remained blissfully unaware of the legacy that flowed in his veins. The internal struggle that consumed Obi-Wan during his years of exile was a battle between his desire to train Luke in the ways of the Force and his fear of repeating the mistakes that had led to Anakin's fall. The memories of his former apprentice, the young man who had become Darth Vader, haunted his every waking moment. The what-ifs and if-onlys that plagued his thoughts were a constant reminder of the failure that had cost the galaxy everything it had held dear. The meditation sessions that had once brought him peace now served only to amplify his guilt and self-doubt. The Force, which had been his constant companion throughout his life, seemed muted and distant, as if it too mourned the loss of the Jedi Order. The connection to his former master, Qui-Gon Jinn, remained frustratingly elusive, the promised guidance from beyond death proving far more difficult to achieve than he had anticipated. The message that shattered his carefully constructed isolation came from an unexpected source. Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, the 10-year-old daughter of Senator Bail Organa, had been kidnapped by agents of the Empire. The holographic plea for help, transmitted by the girl's adoptive father, was a desperate gambit that would require Obi-Wan to abandon the safety of his exile and venture once again into a galaxy that had no place for surviving Jedi. The journey to Alderaan, his first trip off-world since his arrival on Tatooine, was a jarring reminder of how much the galaxy had changed during his years of isolation. The spaceports that had once bustled with the diversity of countless species now operated under the watchful eyes of Imperial forces, their stormtroopers a constant reminder of the Empire's omnipresent authority. The freedom of movement that had once been taken for granted throughout the galaxy was now a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. The planet Alderaan itself, with its snow-capped mountains and peaceful cities, stood as one of the few remaining beacons of civilization in a galaxy that had embraced authoritarianism. The royal palace, where Senator Organa had raised Leia as his own daughter, was a testament to the values that had once defined the Republic. The culture of learning and artistic expression that flourished on the planet served as a reminder of what the galaxy had lost when democracy had been replaced by dictatorship. The kidnapping of Princess Leia was not a random act of violence, but a calculated move in a larger game of political chess. The third sister, known to her fellow Inquisitors as Reva, had orchestrated the operation as part of her own quest for revenge against the Jedi who had failed to protect her during the Temple massacre. Her connection to the traumatic events of Order 66, revealed through carefully constructed flashbacks, provided the emotional foundation for her single-minded pursuit of Obi-Wan Kenobi. The Inquisitorius, the Empire's organization of dark side adepts tasked with hunting down surviving Jedi, had become a feared presence throughout the galaxy. These fallen Jedi, corrupted by the dark side and trained in the arts of intimidation and terror, represented the ultimate perversion of everything the Jedi Order had stood for. Their red lightsabers, weapons that had been corrupted by the dark side, were symbols of the Empire's ability to turn even the most noble beings into instruments of oppression. The Grand Inquisitor, the pale and gaunt leader of the organization, possessed a cold intellect that made him one of the Empire's most effective hunters. His knowledge of Jedi techniques and philosophy, combined with his willingness to use the dark side without reservation, made him a formidable opponent for any surviving member of the Order. The circular lightsaber that marked his rank was a weapon designed to intimidate as much as to kill, its spinning blades a constant reminder of the fate that awaited those who opposed the Empire. The fifth brother and the fourth sister, Reva's fellow Inquisitors, represented different aspects of the dark side's corruption. The fifth brother's brute strength and savage fighting style contrasted sharply with the fourth sister's calculated cruelty, yet both were united in their dedication to the Empire's cause. Their presence on Alderaan, ostensibly to support Reva's mission, created a complex web of rivalries and ambitions that would ultimately work in Obi-Wan's favor. The rescue of Princess Leia from the fortress on Mapuzo, where she had been held as bait for the trap that Reva had set, required all of Obi-Wan's remaining skills and the kind of desperate courage that had sustained him through the Clone Wars. The fortress itself, a monument to Imperial architecture with its stark lines and imposing presence, was designed to break the spirit of those held within its walls. The rescue mission, conducted under the cover of darkness and with minimal equipment, was a testament to the ingenuity and determination that had made the Jedi legendary. The young Princess Leia, despite her tender age, displayed a strength of character and force of will that reminded Obi-Wan of her mother. Her refusal to be intimidated by her captors, her quick thinking under pressure, and her natural leadership abilities marked her as someone who would one day play a crucial role in the galaxy's future. The bond that developed between the aging Jedi and the young princess was built on mutual respect and shared determination to resist the Empire's tyranny. The planet Mapuzo, with its industrial complexes and mining operations, was a world that had been transformed by the Empire's hunger for raw materials. The native population, reduced to the status of laborers in their own homeland, served as a reminder of the human cost of the Empire's economic policies. The underground resistance network that had formed to help refugees and dissidents provided a glimpse of the broader rebellion that was beginning to take shape throughout the galaxy. The confrontation with Darth Vader on Mapuzo was a moment that Obi-Wan had both dreaded and anticipated since his arrival on Tatooine. The mechanical breathing that announced the Dark Lord's presence was a sound that had haunted the former Jedi's nightmares for a decade. The figure that emerged from the shadows was a grotesque parody of the young man Obi-Wan had once trained, his humanity hidden behind a mask of black metal, and his body sustained by machinery that wheezed with each breath. The lightsaber duel that followed was not the graceful combat of the Clone Wars, but a brutal exchange between two beings whose relationship had been destroyed by betrayal and loss. Vader's fighting style, enhanced by his mechanical limbs and driven by a decade of hatred, was a relentless assault that pushed Obi-Wan to the very limits of his abilities. The aging Jedi, his skills dulled by years of exile and his connection to the Force weakened by guilt and despair, found himself overmatched by his former apprentice's raw power. The revelation that came when Obi-Wan managed to damage Vader's helmet, revealing the scarred face of Anakin Skywalker beneath, was a moment of horror that would haunt both combatants for the rest of their lives. The man who had once been the Chosen One, the hero of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Knight who had saved countless lives, was now a burned and broken creature whose very existence was a testament to the dark side's power to corrupt and destroy. The words that Vader spoke in that moment, his claim that he had killed Anakin Skywalker, were both a denial of his past and an acknowledgement of the transformation that had consumed him. The voice that emerged from the damaged respirator was neither fully human nor completely mechanical, a sound that embodied the tragic duality of a being who existed between life and death, between light and darkness, between salvation and damnation. The escape from Mapuzo, accomplished with the help of the underground resistance and the kind of desperate ingenuity that had characterized Obi-Wan's entire career, was a temporary reprieve in a conflict that both men knew was far from over. The Path network that had been established to help refugees and dissidents was a testament to the courage of ordinary beings who risked everything to preserve some small measure of freedom in a galaxy that had embraced tyranny. The journey to Jabim, a world that had been scarred by the Clone Wars and now served as a haven for those fleeing Imperial persecution, brought Obi-Wan into contact with other survivors of the Purge. The underground facility that had been established by the Path, a network of beings dedicated to helping Force-sensitive children and their families escape Imperial persecution, was a beacon of hope in a galaxy that had seemingly abandoned all those who possessed the gift that had once defined the Jedi Order. The children who had been hidden away in the facility, their potential kept secret from the Empire's hunters, represented the future of the Force in a galaxy that had declared war on all who could wield it. Each young face was a reminder of the younglings who had died in the Temple massacre, yet they also embodied the hope that the light side of the Force could never be completely extinguished. Tala Dureth, the Imperial officer who had chosen to betray her oath and join the Resistance, embodied the kind of moral courage that had become increasingly rare in the Empire's service. Her decision to risk everything to help others escape persecution was a reminder that even within the Empire's ranks, there were those who refused to abandon their humanity in service to an inhuman cause. The final confrontation with Reva on Jabim revealed the tragic truth behind her pursuit of Obi-Wan. The third sister's memories of the Temple massacre, her survival as a youngling who had been left for dead among the bodies of her fellow students, provided the emotional foundation for her decade-long quest for revenge. The revelation that she had been seeking not to serve the Empire, but to destroy it from within, added a new dimension to her character and her actions. The lightsaber duel between Obi-Wan and Reva was a battle between two beings whose lives had been shaped by the same traumatic event. The former Jedi, fighting to protect the children in his care, found himself facing an opponent whose pain mirrored his own. The combat was as much about healing old wounds as it was about determining the outcome of their immediate conflict. The redemption of Reva, her choice to abandon her quest for revenge and instead focus on protecting the innocent, was a moment of grace that demonstrated the power of compassion to overcome even the deepest hatred. Her decision to help evacuate the facility rather than pursue her personal vendetta marked a turning point in her character arc and provided a glimpse of the person she might have become had the Empire never risen to power. The final confrontation with Darth Vader on the barren world of Mapuzo was a rematch that would test both combatants in ways that their previous encounter had not. The battlefield, a landscape of broken rocks and twisted metal that reflected the broken relationship between the two men, provided a fitting backdrop for a duel that would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of the galaxy itself. The lightsaber combat that followed was a masterpiece of choreography and emotion. Two warriors whose techniques had been forged in the same crucible now turned against each other in a battle that transcended mere physical conflict. Obi-Wan's defensive style, refined through decades of experience, was perfectly suited to counter Vader's aggressive approach, yet the Dark Lord's raw power and mechanical enhancements made him a formidable opponent. The turning point in the battle came when Obi-Wan managed to overcome his guilt and self-doubt, reconnecting with the Force in a way that he had not experienced since the fall of the Republic. The power that flowed through him was not driven by anger or hatred, but by a serene acceptance of his role in the larger tapestry of the Force. The lightsaber in his hands became an extension of his will, each movement guided by the same wisdom that had made him one of the Order's greatest knights. The defeat of Darth Vader, accomplished through a combination of skill, determination, and the kind of tactical brilliance that had made Obi-Wan famous during the Clone Wars, was a moment of triumph that was tempered by the knowledge that the man beneath the mask could never truly be saved. The conversation that followed, conducted with the kind of emotional honesty that had been absent from their relationship for years, was both a farewell and an acknowledgement of the bond that had once existed between them. The revelation that Vader had orchestrated the entire series of events as a test of his former master's abilities added a new layer of complexity to their relationship. The Dark Lord's claim that he had allowed Obi-Wan to escape, that the entire confrontation had been designed to measure his strength and resolve, was both a boast and a challenge that would influence their future encounters. The return to Tatooine, accomplished with a new understanding of his role in the galaxy's future, marked the beginning of a new chapter in Obi-Wan's life. The hermit who had wallowed in guilt and self-doubt for a decade had been transformed by his experiences into someone who could once again serve as a guardian and protector. The connection to the Force that had been weakened by his despair was now stronger than ever, sustained by a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The first contact with the spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn, his former master, whose guidance had been sought for so long, came as a reward for his spiritual growth and renewed commitment to the light side of the Force. The lessons that the Spirit imparted, teachings about the nature of the Force and the responsibility that came with wielding its power, would guide Obi-Wan through the remaining years of his exile. The young Luke Skywalker, observed from a distance as he went about his daily life on the moisture farm, remained unaware of the Guardian who watched over him. The boy's potential, evident in his quick reflexes and intuitive understanding of machinery, was a constant reminder of the legacy that flowed in his veins. The time when he would need to be trained in the ways of the Force was still years away, but Obi-Wan now possessed the patience and wisdom necessary to wait for that moment. The galaxy that Obi-Wan had left behind was still ruled by the Empire, its citizens still oppressed by a system that valued order over freedom. Yet his experiences had shown him that the light side of the Force could never be completely extinguished, that even in the darkest times there were those who were willing to risk everything to preserve hope and protect the innocent. The network of allies and sympathizers that had been revealed during his mission continued to operate in the shadows, their work providing a foundation for the larger rebellion that was beginning to take shape. The path, the underground resistance, and the individual heroes who had chosen to stand against tyranny were all part of a larger movement that would eventually challenge the Empire's power. The cave on Tatooine, that had once been a place of exile and despair, had been transformed into a sanctuary where a guardian could prepare for the battles that lay ahead. The meditation sessions that had once brought only guilt and self-recrimination now provided the spiritual nourishment necessary to sustain him through the challenges that would come. The Force, which had seemed distant and muted during his years of doubt, now flowed through him with a strength and clarity that reminded him of his youth. The legend of Ben Kenobi, the hermit of the Junland Wastes, would continue to grow among the moisture farmers and traders who occasionally encountered him. Few would ever suspect that the weathered man who sometimes helped them with mechanical problems or offered cryptic advice was once one of the galaxy's most celebrated heroes. The anonymity that had once been a burden was now a blessing, allowing him to serve as a protector while remaining hidden from those who would seek to destroy him. The story of Obi-Wan Kenobi's exile had become a story of redemption and renewal, a testament to the power of hope to overcome even the deepest despair. The man who had once blamed himself for the galaxy's fall had learned to accept his role in its eventual salvation, understanding that the mistakes of the past could not be changed, but that the future remained full of possibilities for those brave enough to seize them. 14 years after the fall of the Republic, the galaxy had settled into the oppressive rhythm of imperial rule, its countless worlds united under the iron fist of an emperor whose authority seemed absolute and unchanging. Yet on the outer rim world of Lothal, where the Empire's industrial machinery had transformed a once pastoral planet into a monument to efficiency and exploitation, the seeds of rebellion were beginning to take root in the most unlikely of places. The planet's surface, once covered with vast grasslands where the native Lothcats roamed freely and the indigenous population lived in harmony with their environment, had been scarred by massive mining operations and industrial complexes. The Empire's hunger for resources had stripped away the natural beauty that had defined Lothal for millennia, replacing it with the stark geometry of Imperial architecture and the constant drone of machinery that never ceased its relentless consumption of the world's wealth. Capital City, the planet's largest settlement, had been transformed from a modest trading post into a sprawling metropolis that served as the focal point for the Empire's operations in the sector. The gleaming towers that housed imperial administrators and corporate executives rose from the center of the city like monuments to authoritarian efficiency, their clean lines and imposing presence designed to remind the population of their place in the new order. Yet in the shadows of these monuments to imperial power, a different kind of story was beginning to unfold. The marketplaces and residential districts that surrounded the administrative center were home to beings who remembered what life had been like before the Empire's arrival, who had not yet forgotten the taste of freedom or the possibility of resistance. Among these beings, whispers of defiance were beginning to spread, carried from one trusted friend to another like seeds scattered on fertile ground. Ezra Bridger, a 14-year-old human boy, whose parents had been among the early victims of the Empire's consolidation of power, lived alone in the ruins of a communications tower that had once connected Lothal to the galaxy's information networks. The tower, abandoned when the Empire established its own communications infrastructure, had become a sanctuary for a young man who had learned to survive through a combination of street wisdom and an intuitive understanding of the Force that he did not yet fully comprehend. The boy's natural abilities, which manifested in an uncanny talent for sensing danger and an almost supernatural luck in avoiding Imperial patrols, had allowed him to carve out a precarious existence in the spaces between the Empire's rigid control mechanisms. His skills as a thief and con artist, honed through years of necessity, were complemented by a natural charisma that made him capable of inspiring trust even in the most suspicious individuals. The con job that would change Ezra's life forever was supposed to be a simple theft of Imperial supplies from a convoy that was transporting weapons to a garrison in the Outer Territories. The plan, conceived with the kind of desperate ingenuity that had sustained him through his years of independence, involved using his knowledge of the local terrain to intercept the convoy at a vulnerable point in its journey. The appearance of the Ghost, a modified VCX-100 light freighter, whose crew had been conducting their own operation against the same Imperial convoy, transformed what should have been a routine theft into an encounter that would reshape the boy's understanding of what was possible in a galaxy dominated by the Empire. The ship's crew, a diverse group of beings united by their opposition to Imperial rule, represented the kind of organized resistance that Ezra had only heard about in whispered rumors. Kanan Jarrus, the ship's pilot and the leader of the small rebel cell, possessed a calmness and confidence that spoke of someone who had found his purpose in life. The man's easy smile and casual demeanor concealed depths that would not be revealed until much later, when the truth of his identity as a surviving Jedi Knight would emerge. His ability to remain hidden in plain sight, to project an image of a simple smuggler while actually serving as one of the galaxy's last guardians of peace and justice, was a testament to the survival skills that had kept him alive through the dark years following Order 66. Hera Syndulla, the Ghost's Twi'lek pilot and the operational heart of the rebel cell, brought to the group a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering moral conviction that made her natural leader material. Her father's legacy as a resistance fighter during the Clone Wars had instilled in her a deep understanding of the principles worth fighting for, while her years of experience in the galaxy's criminal underworld had taught her the practical skills necessary to translate ideals into action. The relationship between Hera and Kanan was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to their cause. Yet beneath the surface lay depths of affection that neither dared to acknowledge openly. Their partnership, forged through years of dangerous missions and narrow escapes, had evolved into something that transcended mere professional collaboration while remaining constrained by the demands of their dangerous lifestyle. Gorazaborelios, known to his friends as Zeb, was a member of the Lasat species, whose homeworld had been devastated by the Empire's brutal pacification campaign. The massive warrior, whose strength and combat skills had made him a formidable opponent in countless battles, carried within him the grief of a survivor who had witnessed the destruction of everything he had once held dear. His participation in the rebel cell was driven not by political ideology, but by a personal need for vengeance against the system that had murdered his people. The Honor Guard of Lasan, the elite military unit that Zeb had once served with such distinction, had been annihilated during the Empire's assault on his homeworld. The bow rifle that he carried, a weapon that had been passed down through generations of Lasad warriors, was one of the few remnants of a civilization that had been erased from the galaxy through the systematic application of Imperial military doctrine. Sabine Wren, the youngest member of the crew, was a Mandalorian artist whose explosive expertise and creative talents had made her invaluable to the Rebel Cell's operations. Her background as a former Imperial Academy cadet who had witnessed the Empire's true nature firsthand provided the group with insights into Imperial tactics and psychology that would prove crucial in their missions. The colorful armor that she wore, decorated with designs that reflected her artistic sensibilities, was a deliberate rejection of the conformity that the Empire demanded from its citizens. The conflict between Sabine's Mandalorian heritage and her rejection of the Empire's militaristic values was a constant source of internal tension, yet it was also the source of her strength. Her ability to create beauty in the midst of destruction, to find artistic expression even in the planning and execution of military operations, represented a form of resistance that went beyond mere political opposition. Chopper, the cantankerous astromech droid, whose personality had been shaped by decades of experiences with organic beings, served as the Ghost's technical specialist and the group's most reliable source of comic relief. The droid's sarcastic comments and tendency to prioritize his own interests over the mission's objectives concealed a deep loyalty to his organic companions that would be tested repeatedly throughout their adventures. The early missions conducted by the Ghost crew were small-scale operations designed to disrupt Imperial activities, while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that would have resulted in their destruction. The theft of supplies intended for Imperial garrisons, the rescue of beings who had been arrested for political crimes, the sabotage of equipment that supported the Empire's industrial operations, all represented pinpricks against a system whose vast resources made it seem invulnerable to such minor annoyances. Yet each successful operation served multiple purposes beyond its immediate tactical objectives. The supplies that were stolen from Imperial convoys were distributed to the populations that had been impoverished by the Empire's economic policies, creating goodwill among the very people whose support would be essential for any larger resistance movement. The rescue of political prisoners demonstrated that the Empire's authority was not absolute, that there were those willing to risk everything to challenge its power. The discovery of Ezra's Force sensitivity, revealed through his ability to sense the crew's emotions and anticipate their actions, added a new dimension to the group's capabilities, while also creating new challenges. Kanan's reluctance to reveal his own identity as a Jedi Knight was rooted in his fear of the responsibility that training another Force-sensitive being would entail, particularly given the fate that had befallen his own master during the Purge. The gradual revelation of Kanan's true identity, accomplished through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters that tested Ezra's perception and intuition, was a moment of transformation for both master and student. The lightsaber that Kanan had kept hidden for so many years became not just a weapon but a symbol of continuity with the past and hope for the future. The training sessions that followed, conducted in the hidden corners of the Ghost, while the ship traveled between missions, represented an attempt to preserve the Jedi tradition in circumstances that the Order's founders could never have imagined. The lessons in meditation, lightsaber combat and Force philosophy were necessarily abbreviated and practical, focused on the skills that would be most useful in the kind of guerrilla warfare that the rebels were fighting. The construction of Ezra's lightsaber, a unique weapon that incorporated both traditional Jedi design elements and the practical requirements of their underground existence, was a rite of passage that marked his transition from a street thief to a Padawan learner. The weapon's unusual design, which included a built-in blaster for situations where stealth was more important than the elegance of traditional lightsaber combat, reflected the compromise between idealism and practicality that defined the rebel movement. The expanded operations that followed Ezra's integration into the crew brought them into contact with other resistance cells that were operating throughout the galaxy. The network of rebels, smugglers, and sympathizers that had emerged in response to Imperial oppression was more extensive than any of them had realized, yet it was also more fragmented and poorly coordinated than it needed to be to pose a serious threat to the Empire. The introduction of Fulcrum, a mysterious contact who provided intelligence and coordination services to various rebel cells, marked the beginning of the group's integration into a larger movement that would eventually become the Rebel Alliance. The encrypted communications and coded messages that Fulcrum used to coordinate activities across multiple star systems suggested an organization that was both more sophisticated and more dangerous than the Empire had realized. The revelation that Fulcrum was actually Ahsoka Tano, the former Padawan of Anakin Skywalker, who had left the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars, was a moment of profound significance for both Kanan and Ezra. The presence of another survivor of the Purge, particularly one whose experience and skills had been honed through years of independent operations, provided them with a mentor whose guidance would prove invaluable in the challenges that lay ahead. The confrontation with the Grand Inquisitor, the Empire's chief hunter of surviving Jedi, represented the rebels' first encounter with the kind of systematic opposition that the Empire could bring to bear against Force-sensitive opponents. The pale, gaunt figure, whose knowledge of Jedi techniques and philosophy had been corrupted by his embrace of the dark side, was a reminder of what the rebels were fighting against and what they risked becoming if they allowed hatred to consume them. The lightsaber duels that followed, fought in locations ranging from the industrial complexes of Lothal to the ancient Jedi temple on the planet's surface, were battles that transcended mere physical combat. Each encounter was a test of philosophy as much as skill, a contest between different visions of what the Force represented and how it should be used. The discovery of the ancient Jedi temple on Lothal, hidden beneath the planet's surface and protected by mechanisms that had been designed to test the worthiness of those who sought to enter, provided the rebels with access to knowledge and resources that had been lost since the Purge. The temple's connection to the broader network of Jedi sites throughout the galaxy suggested possibilities for resistance that went beyond conventional military operations. The training that Ezra received within the temple's ancient chambers, guided by the recorded wisdom of Jedi masters who had died centuries before his birth, was a more comprehensive education in the Force than Kanan had been able to provide. The holocrons that had been preserved within the temple's vaults contained lessons in techniques and philosophies that had been developed over millennia of Jedi scholarship. The arrival of Darth Vader on Lothal, summoned by the rebels' increasing effectiveness and the threat they posed to Imperial operations in the sector, marked a turning point in their campaign. The Dark Lord's presence transformed what had been a relatively low-level insurgency into a high-stakes conflict that would test every member of the crew to their limits. The encounter between Ahsoka and her former master, revealed through the damage inflicted on Vader's helmet during their lightsaber duel, was a moment of tragedy that embodied the larger destruction that the Empire had brought to the galaxy. The confirmation that Anakin Skywalker had indeed become the Empire's chief enforcer was a revelation that shattered illusions and forced difficult choices about the nature of redemption and the possibility of salvation. The sacrifice that Ahsoka made to allow her companions to escape from the Sith temple on Malachor, disappearing into the collapsing structure, while Vader emerged broken but alive, was a reminder of the cost that the rebellion exacted from those who chose to fight against overwhelming odds. Her apparent death, though later revealed to be more complex than it initially appeared, served as a catalyst for the surviving rebels' transformation from a small resistance cell into active participants in a galaxy-wide rebellion. The integration of the Ghost Crew into the broader Rebel Alliance, formalized through their participation in the Battle of Atollon and their subsequent assignments to larger military operations, marked the end of their independence and the beginning of their service to a cause that was larger than any individual or small group. The transition from guerrilla fighters to members of a structured military organization required adjustments that were not always easy to make. The personal relationships that had sustained the crew through their years of independent operation were tested by the demands of serving in a larger organization with more rigid hierarchies and formal procedures. The casual intimacy that had characterized their interactions aboard the Ghost was necessarily modified to accommodate the requirements of military discipline and operational security. The Battle of Scarif, though fought without the direct participation of the Ghost Crew, represented the kind of large-scale operation that their early missions had made possible. The intelligence networks that had been established, the supply lines that had been disrupted, the Imperial personnel who had been eliminated or turned, all contributed to the conditions that made the Rebel Alliance's first major victory possible. The liberation of Lothal, the culmination of years of resistance activities that had begun with simple theft and sabotage, required the kind of coordinated effort that demonstrated how much the rebel movement had evolved since its humble beginnings. The operation, which involved multiple cells working in concert to achieve objectives that none of them could have accomplished alone, was a testament to the power of organization and cooperation in the face of overwhelming opposition. The final confrontation with Grand Admiral Thrawn, the Empire's most brilliant military strategist, represented the ultimate test of everything the rebels had learned during their years of struggle. The blue-skinned Chiss officer, whose understanding of art and culture had given him insights into the psychology of his enemies, was an opponent whose intellectual capabilities matched his military resources. The sacrifice that Ezra made to defeat Thrawn, using his connection to the Force to summon the Purgil, massive spacefaring creatures whose hyperspace capabilities had been the inspiration for the technology that connected the galaxy, was a moment of triumph that came at a terrible personal cost. The young man's disappearance into the unknown regions of space, taking with him the Empire's most dangerous commander, was a victory that ensured Lothal's liberation while leaving his friends and family to mourn his loss. The epilogue that followed, showing the transformation of Lothal from an imperial stronghold into a free world where the natural beauty that had been destroyed was slowly being restored, was a reminder of what the rebellion was ultimately fighting for. The liberation of a single world, achieved through years of struggle and sacrifice, represented the possibility that the galaxy itself might one day be free from the Empire's oppression. The legacy of the Ghost Crew, their transformation from a small group of misfits into the founders of a movement that would eventually topple the Empire, was a testament to the power of ordinary beings to achieve extraordinary things when they were united by a common cause and sustained by unshakable faith in the possibility of a better future. Their story, which began with simple theft and ended with the liberation of worlds, demonstrated that even the smallest acts of resistance could grow into something that would change the galaxy forever. The network of relationships and alliances that had been established during their years of struggle would continue to influence the course of galactic history long after their individual stories had ended. The principles they had fought for, the tactics they had developed, the sacrifices they had made, all became part of the foundation upon which the new republic would eventually be built. The Force, which had guided them through their darkest moments and provided them with the strength to continue fighting when victory seemed impossible, had woven their individual destinies into a larger tapestry that encompassed the fate of the entire galaxy. Their story was both an ending and a beginning, a conclusion to the Empire's period of absolute dominance and the opening chapter of a new era of freedom and hope that would inspire generations of beings yet to be born. In the final years before the Death Star's completion would forever change the balance of power in the galaxy, the seeds of rebellion had spread to countless worlds, taking root in the most unlikely places and growing in the shadows of the Empire's seemingly absolute authority. On the industrial world of Ferrix, where the smell of molten metal and the sound of hammering filled the air from dawn to dusk, a young man named Cassian Andor was about to discover that the personal had become political, that private grief could become public resistance, and that the small acts of defiance that had sustained him through his youth would eventually contribute to the downfall of the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. The planet Ferrix was a world that the Empire had transformed into a monument to industrial efficiency, its surface covered with factories and foundries that produced the components necessary to maintain the vast military machine that kept the galaxy under Imperial control. The native population, reduced to the status of workers in their own homeland, had developed a culture of quiet resistance that expressed itself through subtle acts of non-cooperation and the preservation of traditions that the Empire would have preferred to see disappear. The salvage yards that dotted the planet's surface were more than simple repositories for discarded machinery. They were libraries of technological history, museums of the galaxy's industrial past, and treasure troves for those who possessed the knowledge to recognize value in what others had discarded. The workers who labored in these yards, including Cassian's adoptive mother Marva, had developed an almost mystical understanding of the relationship between form and function, between the machine and the person who operated it. Cassian's childhood on Ferrix had been shaped by the daily rhythms of industrial life, the constant noise of manufacturing, and the subtle undercurrents of resistance that flowed through the community like an underground river. His adoptive mother, Marva Andor, was a woman whose quiet strength had been forged in the crucible of imperial oppression, her determination to maintain her dignity and independence serving as a model for her son's own development. The relationship between Cassian and Marva was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to survive under imperial rule. The lessons she taught him were not formal instruction, but rather the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of life in a galaxy where the wrong word or gesture could result in imprisonment or death. The inciting incident that would transform Cassian from a small-time thief and black market dealer into a key figure in the rebellion began with a simple search for information about his past. The young man's quest to learn the truth about his origins, his need to understand the circumstances that had brought him to Ferrix as a child, led him to make inquiries that would attract the attention of both the Empire's security forces and the nascent rebellion that was beginning to organize in opposition to imperial rule. The corporate sector authority, the Empire's mechanism for controlling industrial production and resource extraction throughout the galaxy, had established a presence on Ferrix that was both pervasive and subtly oppressive. The security forces that patrolled the planet's industrial districts were not the stormtroopers that had become the Empire's most visible symbol of authority, but rather a more insidious form of control that worked through surveillance, intimidation, and the systematic erosion of privacy and autonomy. The investigation that followed Cassian's initial inquiries was conducted by Deputy Inspector Cyril Khan, a young Imperial officer whose dedication to duty and faith in the system had made him a model employee of the corporate sector authority. The man's rigid adherence to protocol and his belief that the Empire represented the natural order of galactic civilization would be tested by his pursuit of a case that would reveal the complex moral landscape that existed beneath the surface of Imperial rule. The pursuit of Cassian through the industrial districts of Ferrix became a cat-and-mouse game that revealed the extent to which the local population had developed mechanisms for protecting their own against imperial authority. The network of informants and sympathizers that had grown up around the salvage yards and manufacturing facilities was a testament to the community's collective refusal to accept the Empire's version of law and order. The escape from Ferrix accomplished with the help of Luthen Rajiel, a mysterious figure whose antiquarian shop on Coruscant served as a front for rebellion activities, marked the beginning of Cassian's transformation from a local criminal to a galactic revolutionary. The man who had come to recruit him, whose refined manners and expensive clothing concealed depths of commitment and ruthlessness that would not be revealed until much later, represented the kind of organized resistance that Cassian had only heard about in whispered rumors. Luthen's network of contacts and resources, built up over years of careful cultivation and maintained through a combination of personal charisma and strategic thinking, was one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the galaxy. The antiquarian's shop, with its collection of artifacts from the Republic's golden age, served as both a cover for his activities and a shrine to the values that the rebellion was fighting to restore. The mission to Oltani, a remote world where the Empire maintained a garrison that protected one of their most sensitive financial operations, was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. The theft of the Imperial payroll, $250 million credits that represented 3 months' worth of military salaries for an entire sector, would provide the rebellion with the resources necessary to expand their operations while simultaneously demonstrating their capability to strike at the heart of Imperial power. The team that was assembled for the Oltani mission was a microcosm of the rebellion itself, a group of individuals from different backgrounds and with different motivations who had been brought together by their shared opposition to Imperial rule. Each member of the team brought unique skills and perspectives that would be essential for the mission's success, yet their diversity also created tensions that would need to be managed carefully. Vel Sartha, the mission's leader, was a young woman whose privileged background had provided her with the education and connections necessary to understand the broader political implications of their actions. Her transformation from a sheltered daughter of the elite to a committed revolutionary was a journey that had required her to abandon the comfortable certainties of her youth and embrace the dangerous uncertainties of active resistance. The relationship between Vel and her cousin Mon Mothma, the senator from Chandrila, who was secretly providing financial support for rebellion activities, illustrated the complex web of relationships that connected the rebellion's public face to its underground operations. The risks that Mon Mothma took in supporting the rebellion, both financial and political, were balanced against the potential rewards of overthrowing a system that had corrupted the very institutions she had spent her life serving. Clem, the former Imperial officer whose disillusionment with the Empire had led him to join the rebellion, represented the kind of insider knowledge that was essential for operations against Imperial targets. His understanding of Imperial procedures and psychology, combined with his access to current intelligence about security measures and personnel, made him an invaluable asset despite the questions about his loyalty that his background inevitably raised. The preparation for the Oltani mission required months of careful planning and reconnaissance, with each member of the team contributing their expertise to the development of a plan that would need to account for countless variables and potential complications. The Imperial garrison that protected the facility was staffed by professional soldiers whose training and equipment made them formidable opponents, while the security systems that protected the payroll were among the most sophisticated in the galaxy. The execution of the mission, timed to coincide with the Oltani Eye, a celestial phenomenon that would provide both cover for their approach and a distraction for the Imperial forces, was a masterpiece of coordination and timing. The team's ability to work together despite their different backgrounds and the high-stress environment of the mission was a testament to the kind of unity that the rebellion would need to cultivate if it hoped to challenge the Empire's power. The theft of the Imperial payroll, accomplished through a combination of technical expertise and desperate courage, sent shockwaves throughout the Empire's financial and military establishments. The loss of such a significant sum of money was embarrassing enough, but the demonstration that the rebellion possessed the capability to strike at targets that had been considered secure was far more damaging to Imperial morale and credibility. The Imperial response to the Oltani robbery was swift and comprehensive, with security measures being implemented throughout the galaxy that would make future operations far more difficult. The crackdown that followed, which included mass arrests, enhanced surveillance, and the suspension of civil liberties on countless worlds, was a reminder of the price that the galaxy's population paid for acts of resistance. The personal cost of the mission for Cassian was measured not just in the lives of his teammates who did not survive the operation, but in the transformation of his own understanding of what it meant to be a rebel. The young man who had joined the mission primarily for the financial rewards found himself committed to a cause that demanded everything he had to give and promised nothing in return except the possibility of a better future for others. The return to Ferrix, accomplished months after the Oltani mission and under circumstances that had changed dramatically since his departure, brought Cassian face to face with the consequences of his actions. The increased Imperial presence on the planet, the surveillance and harassment of the local population, and the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had settled over the community were all indirect results of his involvement in the rebellion. The reunion with Marver, his adoptive mother whose health had declined during his absence, was a moment of joy tempered by the knowledge that their time together was limited. The woman who had raised him, who had taught him the values that had ultimately led him to join the rebellion, was dying of a disease that the Empire's medical system was either unable or unwilling to treat effectively. The Imperial crackdown on Ferrix had transformed the planet from a place where subtle resistance was possible into a police state where any form of dissent was met with immediate and violent suppression. The security forces that patrolled the streets, the informants who reported on their neighbors' activities, and the climate of fear that had replaced the community's traditional solidarity were all symptoms of an empire that was beginning to recognize the threat that the rebellion posed to its authority. The arrest and subsequent imprisonment of Cassian, accomplished through a combination of bad luck and the Empire's increasingly sophisticated surveillance capabilities, provided him with first-hand experience of the Imperial justice system's brutal efficiency. The prison on Narkina 5, where he was sent to serve his sentence, was a facility designed to break the spirit of its inmates through a combination of physical hardship and psychological manipulation. The conditions on Narkina 5 were calculated to reduce human beings to the status of machines, their days filled with repetitive labor that served no purpose except to occupy their time and drain their energy. The prisoners, drawn from across the galaxy and representing every species and background that the Empire had deemed criminal, were united only by their shared suffering and their gradually eroding hope of ever seeing freedom again. The work shifts that structured life in the prison were designed to prevent the formation of the kind of relationships that might lead to organized resistance. The constant surveillance, the arbitrary punishment for minor infractions, and the systematic dehumanization of the inmates were all part of a program designed to ensure that those who entered the facility would never again pose a threat to Imperial authority. Kenobi, the floor manager, whose collaboration with the Imperial authorities had earned him certain privileges, represented the kind of moral compromise that the Empire forced upon its subjects. The man's gradual transformation from a collaborator to a leader of the prison uprising was a journey that illustrated the power of circumstances to reveal the true character of individuals who had been forced to make impossible choices. The uprising on Narkina 5, sparked by the revelation that the Empire had no intention of ever releasing the prisoners regardless of the length of their sentences, was a moment of collective action that demonstrated the power of desperate people to achieve the impossible when they had nothing left to lose. The prisoners' ability to overcome the security systems that had been designed to contain them was a testament to the ingenuity and determination that the human spirit could display even under the most oppressive circumstances. The escape from Narkina 5, accomplished through a combination of careful planning and desperate improvisation, was a victory that came at a terrible cost. The prisoners who died during the uprising, including Kenobi, who could not bring himself to jump into the ocean that surrounded the facility, were martyrs whose sacrifice would inspire others to resist the Empire's authority. The period following Cassian's escape from prison, was marked by a gradual recognition that his involvement in the rebellion had become a permanent commitment rather than a temporary adventure. The network of contacts and resources that Luthen had provided, the skills and knowledge that he had acquired through his various missions, and the reputation that he had developed within the rebellion's intelligence apparatus, all combined to make him one of the movement's most valuable assets. The intelligence work that consumed the final years before the Death Star's completion was a different kind of warfare, one that was fought with information rather than weapons, with patience rather than violence, and with the kind of careful attention to detail that could make the difference between success and catastrophe. The networks of informants and sympathizers that were cultivated throughout the galaxy were the rebellion's eyes and ears, their reports providing the leadership with the information necessary to make strategic decisions. The relationship between Cassian and Jyn Erso, the daughter of the Death Star's chief designer, would eventually become one of the most important partnerships in the rebellion's history. Their shared commitment to the cause, their complementary skills and backgrounds, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for the possibility of victory would make them the ideal team for the mission that would ultimately determine the fate of the galaxy. The network of safe houses and hidden bases that had been established throughout the galaxy provided the rebellion with the infrastructure necessary to conduct operations against Imperial targets while remaining hidden from the Empire's security forces. The men and women who maintained these facilities, often at great personal risk, were the unsung heroes of the rebellion, their anonymous contributions making possible the more visible acts of resistance that would capture the galaxy's attention. The gradual revelation of the Death Star's existence and capabilities, pieced together through intelligence reports and the testimonies of defectors, was a moment of horror that transformed the rebellion from a movement seeking political change into a desperate struggle for survival. The weapon's ability to destroy entire planets represented a level of destructive capability that made conventional military resistance seem futile, yet it also provided the rebellion with a target whose destruction would deal a decisive blow to the Empire's authority. The final mission to Scarif, the tropical world where the Death Star's technical specifications were stored, would require everything that the rebellion had learned during its years of struggle against Imperial rule. The operation would demand the kind of coordination and sacrifice that had characterized the movement from its earliest days, yet it would also provide the opportunity to strike a blow against the Empire that would change the course of galactic history. The death of Marva Andor, Cassian's adoptive mother, served as both a personal tragedy and a symbol of the broader losses that the rebellion had suffered during its struggle against the Empire. Her funeral on Ferrix, attended by friends and neighbors who had known her throughout her life, became a moment of collective mourning that transcended the boundaries between the personal and the political. The speech that Marva had recorded before her death, played at her funeral through a holographic projector, was a call to action that inspired the people of Ferrix to rise up against their imperial oppressors. The uprising that followed, though ultimately unsuccessful in military terms, was a demonstration of the power of ordinary people to resist tyranny when they were inspired by the example of those who had gone before them. The transformation of Cassian Andor from a small-time criminal to a key figure in the rebellion was a journey that illustrated the power of circumstances to shape individual destiny. The young man who had initially joined the rebellion for personal reasons had become someone whose commitment to the cause transcended any consideration of personal gain or safety. The final phase of the rebellion's struggle against the Empire, the period leading up to the Battle of Yavin and the destruction of the Death Star, would be shaped by the networks and relationships that had been established during the years of patient preparation and sacrifice. The intelligence that had been gathered, the contacts that had been cultivated, and the skills that had been developed would all contribute to the rebellion's ultimate victory. The legacy of the men and women who had fought and died during the rebellion's early years would live on in the new republic that would eventually emerge from the ashes of the Empire. Their sacrifice, their courage, and their unwavering commitment to the cause of freedom would serve as an inspiration for future generations who would face their own challenges in the ongoing struggle to preserve democracy and justice in a galaxy that would always be threatened by the forces of tyranny and oppression. The story of Cassian Andor and his journey from Ferrix to Scarif was both an individual tale of transformation and a microcosm of the larger struggle that had consumed the galaxy for decades. His evolution from a man motivated by personal concerns to someone willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good embodied the moral growth that the rebellion had demanded from all its participants. The quiet heroism of ordinary people who had chosen to resist the Empire's authority, often at great personal cost and without any guarantee of success, was the foundation upon which the rebellion's eventual victory was built. Their stories, largely unknown to the galaxy at large, were the true chronicles of the Empire's downfall and the restoration of hope to a galaxy that had almost forgotten what freedom meant. And so we reach the end of our journey through the prequel era, that magnificent and tragic period when the galaxy's greatest hopes gave birth to its darkest nightmares, when the light of 1,000-year peace was extinguished by the very hands that had been meant to protect it, as the twin suns of Tatooine set behind the endless dunes where our tale began, casting long shadows across the desert that had witnessed both the birth of legends and their transformation into something unrecognizable. We find ourselves at the threshold of a new age. The Death Star plans, stolen at such terrible cost from the archives of Scarif, were already making their way across the galaxy in the hands of Princess Leia, the young woman whose courage and determination would prove to be the key to unlocking the Empire's destruction. The sacrifice of Cassian Andor, Jyn Erso, and their companions had not been in vain, for their final act of defiance had provided the rebellion with the one thing that could turn the tide of war. On the forest moon of Andor, where ancient trees stretched toward the stars and the Ewok tribes maintained their primitive yet profound connection to the natural world, the second Death Star was nearing completion. The Emperor's presence aboard the battle station was intended to oversee the final stages of construction, yet it would ultimately serve as the catalyst for his own downfall. The trap that had been set for the rebellion would become the Empire's grave, and the Sith Lord who had orchestrated the galaxy's fall would find himself facing the consequences of his grand design. The prophecy of the Chosen One, spoken so many years ago by Qui-Gon Jinn in the dusty streets of Mos Espa, was finally approaching its fulfillment. Yet the balance that would be restored to the Force would come not through the destruction of the Sith alone, but through the redemption of the man who had fallen furthest into darkness. Anakin Skywalker, the boy who had dreamed of adventure among the stars, still existed beneath the mechanical shell of Darth Vader, and his love for his son would prove stronger than the Emperor's hold over his soul. The gentle morning light that filtered through the moisture farm's simple windows on Tatooine illuminated the face of a young man whose destiny was still unfolding. Luke Skywalker, raised in the same humble circumstances that had shaped his father's early years, possessed the same restless spirit and innate goodness that had once made Anakin a symbol of hope throughout the galaxy. The lightsaber that would one day rest at his side, the weapon that his father had wielded during the Clone Wars, waited in the Hermit's Cave like a sleeping promise of the adventures that lay ahead. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the guardian whose patient vigil had protected the boy throughout his youth, continued his meditation in the depths of the desert. The Force flowed through him with a serenity that had been hard-won through years of reflection and acceptance. The guilt that had once consumed him had been transformed into wisdom, and the failure that had haunted his dreams had become the foundation for a deeper understanding of the light side's true nature. The spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn, finally able to manifest to his former apprentice after years of patient teaching from beyond the veil of death, brought with him the wisdom of ages and the promise of continuity. The technique of retaining consciousness after death, the secret that he had discovered through his connection to the living force, would ensure that the Jedi tradition would survive, even if the last of the surviving knights were to fall in the battles ahead. On Alderaan, Princess Leia was growing into the leader that the galaxy would need in its darkest hour. The peaceful world that had raised her with its snow-capped mountains and crystalline cities had instilled in her the values of democracy and justice that would guide her through the trials ahead. The royal palace where she had learned the arts of diplomacy and statecraft would soon be nothing more than atoms scattered across the void, yet the principles that had been taught within its walls would survive to inspire a new generation of leaders. The hidden rebel bases that dotted the galaxy's rim territories were filled with beings who had answered the call to resist tyranny. The pilots who would fly against the Death Star, the soldiers who would fight on the beaches of Scarif, the technicians who would maintain the ships and weapons that would bring down an empire, all represented the countless individual choices that had led to this moment. Each person who had chosen to stand against the darkness had contributed to the tapestry of resistance that would ultimately strangle the Empire. Master Yoda, ancient and wise beyond mortal comprehension, waited in the swamps of Dagobah for the student who would complete his training. The diminutive Jedi Master, whose understanding of the Force had been refined through centuries of study and contemplation, would serve as the bridge between the old order and the new. The lessons he would teach, drawn from the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 generations of Jedi, would ensure that the knowledge of the light side would not die with him. The Millennium Falcon, that remarkable ship that had already begun to accumulate the legends that would make it famous throughout the galaxy, rested in a hangar on some distant world. The modifications that Lando Calrissian had made during his years of ownership, combined with the unique consciousness of Len 337 that still resided within its computer systems, had created a vessel that was perfectly suited for the adventures that lay ahead. The ship that would carry heroes to their destinies and deliver hope to the galaxy's darkest corners was waiting for the moment when fate would bring it together with the crew that would make it legendary. Han Solo and Chewbacca, partners in a friendship that transcended the boundaries of species and culture, continued their work as smugglers and independent operators. The cynical exterior that Han had developed as protection against a hostile galaxy concealed a heart that remained capable of heroism, while the Wookiee's loyalty and strength provided the foundation for a partnership that would endure through the trials ahead. The life debt that bound them together was more than a cultural obligation. It was a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. The Force itself, that mystical energy field that connected all living things, flowed through the galaxy like a river of light. The disturbance that had been created by the rise of the Sith was beginning to heal, though the process would require sacrifice and struggle beyond anything the galaxy had yet experienced. The balance that would be restored was not the simple triumph of good over evil, but a deeper harmony that acknowledged the necessity of both light and darkness in the cosmic order. In the depths of space, where the stars wheeled in their eternal dance and the cosmic forces that governed the universe played out their ancient patterns, the stage was being set for the final act of the drama that had begun with the birth of a slave boy on a desert world. The choices that had been made, the sacrifices that had been offered, the love that had been given and lost and found again, all were part of a larger design that stretched across generations and encompassed the fate of countless worlds. The children who had been born during the dark years of imperial rule, raised in the shadow of tyranny yet nurtured by parents who remembered freedom, would grow up to become the architects of a new age. The seeds of rebellion that had been planted in the hearts of the oppressed were beginning to sprout, and the harvest that would come would sweep away the old order and replace it with something that honored the dreams of those who had fought and died for the possibility of a better future. The Clone Wars, that terrible conflict that had consumed the galaxy for 3 years, had taught valuable lessons about the nature of war and the price of peace. The generation that had fought in those battles, those who had survived the transformation of the Republic into the Empire, carried within them the memory of what had been lost, and the determination to ensure that such a tragedy would never be repeated. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant, its ancient spires still reaching toward the sky, despite the darkness that had befallen the Order, stood as a monument to the ideals that had sustained the galaxy through its brightest days. The knowledge that had been preserved within its walls, the wisdom of countless generations of Jedi Masters, would not be lost forever. The holocrons that had been scattered throughout the galaxy, the teachings that had been passed down through hidden channels, the techniques that had been preserved by survivors of the Purge, all would contribute to the resurrection of the Order when the time was right. The ordinary citizens of the galaxy, those beings who had never wielded a lightsaber or commanded a starship, who had never made speeches in the Senate or led armies into battle, were the true heroes of the story that was unfolding. Their quiet acts of courage, their refusal to abandon their principles even when faced with overwhelming pressure, their willingness to help strangers and protect the innocent, all represented the foundation upon which a just society could be built. The moisture farmers of Tatooine, who had learned to extract life from the desert's harsh embrace, embodied the kind of perseverance that would be needed to rebuild a galaxy that had been shattered by war. Their simple faith in the possibility of tomorrow, their willingness to work for a future that they might never see, their dedication to the values that made life worth living, all served as a reminder that hope was not a luxury but a necessity for survival. The cantinas and spaceports that served as gathering places for the galaxy's travelers were filled with stories of heroism and sacrifice, of ordinary beings who had chosen to do extraordinary things when faced with impossible choices. The smugglers and pirates, the merchants and mechanics, the pilots and passengers who moved through these spaces carried with them the news of the rebellion's growing strength and the Empire's increasing desperation. The music that drifted from these gathering places, the laughter that rose above the din of conversation, the tears that were shed for friends who would never return, all were part of the great symphony of life that continued to play even in the galaxy's darkest hours. The cultural diversity that the Empire had tried to suppress, the individual voices that had been silenced by authoritarian rule, were beginning to speak again with growing confidence and strength. The force that flowed through all living things was not diminished by the darkness that had fallen over the galaxy. Instead, it had been concentrated and purified, focused into the hearts of those who had chosen to resist evil and protect the innocent. The power that had once been dispersed among thousands of Jedi was now concentrated in a few individuals who would use it to light the way for others to follow. The binary sunset that painted the sky over Tatooine in shades of gold and crimson was a daily reminder of the beauty that existed in even the most desolate places. The twin suns that had witnessed the birth of legends and the fall of heroes would continue their eternal dance, casting light across the desert while the galaxy prepared for the dawn of a new age. As the stars emerged one by one in the deepening twilight, their light carrying the promise of countless worlds where freedom might yet take root, the Force whispered its eternal message to those who had the wisdom to listen. The darkness was not permanent, the tyranny was not absolute, and the hope that had been kindled in the hearts of the faithful would grow into a flame that would illuminate the galaxy. The story that had begun with a young boy's dreams of adventure among the stars was far from over. The choices that would be made in the years ahead, the sacrifices that would be offered, the love that would be given and received, all would contribute to the great tapestry of destiny that the Force was weaving. The balance that would be restored would not be the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in the galaxy's long history. Sleep now, gentle travelers, and let the Force be with you. The stars will continue their eternal vigil, the twin suns will rise again over the desert, and the light of hope will never be extinguished as long as there are those who choose to kindle it in their hearts. The galaxy far, far away will endure, and the stories of those who fought for its freedom will inspire generations yet to come. In the silence of the desert night, where the only sounds are the whisper of sand against stone and the distant call of the great dragon. The Force flows like a river of light, carrying with it the dreams of all who have ever looked up at the stars and dared to hope for something better. The prequel era has ended, but the legend it birthed will echo through eternity, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of hope can never be completely extinguished. The twin suns set behind the dunes, and the stars emerge to watch over a galaxy that sleeps, dreaming of the dawn that will surely come.